Let me do a meeting overview just to discuss why we're here, what we hope to achieve, and how we're going to get there. Next, Stace. The overarching goal today is to identify fire science and management needs and discuss tools and approaches to resource assessments and adaptation strategies for fire dynamics in future climates in the Southwest bioregions. We've structured our breakout groups and our talks by key Southwest bioregions: Western Forest, Desert, and Mediterranean Chaparral. Please contribute to discussions on your bioregion today. But also I encourage you to ask yourself this: what can I learn about fire-climate interactions in other bioregions, and how can I apply what I've learned to my own? Next, please. So I want to get a little bit more granular on the objectives. So this is what we hope to achieve today: provide awareness of tools and generate a list of tools and data and science needed to meet fire challenges in future and non-analog landscapes. Suggest how we might facilitate accomplishing identified needs and integrate them into fire management. And lastly, make connections, which is a little tough to do in a virtual format, but I think we can do that in the breakout groups. So I want to come back to that second bullet, and I've got underlined there: to meet fire challenges. Next slide, please. These are the fire challenges that you identified when you were registering for the meeting. So thanks for contributing to those. These are the biggies. These are the common ones. Forecasting climate change impacts on fire dynamics. Working cooperatively to align tools and science with decision-making support. Community preparedness and resilience. This is human community resilience. Invasive vegetation and fueling fires. So that's invasive species and fuel management. Post-fire recovery and restoration, and impacts on watersheds and aquatic and coastal systems. I want to come back to those first two bullets: forecasting climate change and working cooperatively. Next, Stace. These notions or ideas of future climates and working together, these were topics shared among agencies. We saw this in the registration information that you provided. But I want to run with these shared goals a little bit more, and I want to highlight them with a couple examples. First, this is from the USGS Wildfire Strategic Plan. Improve understanding of impacts of climate change on fire behavior to develop ecologically informed strategies for management and conservation. This one is from the National Cohesive Wildfire Management Strategy. Federal agencies, local, state, tribal governments, supporting one another, engaging in collaborative planning and decision-making. Next, please. Still running with this theme of future climates and working together, shared goals among agencies. This one is at the heart, I think, of this meeting, and it's from the National Park Service. Climate change will create novel communities and environments, sometimes called no analog conditions. The future will be characterized by climatic and seasonal patterns for which we have no modern or historical reference. To address the no analogs, we can begin with manager needs, identifying those, and building connections across disciplines and organizations. I hope we can do some of that today, and I think we can. Next slide, please. We have a diverse agenda today, and I'm excited about it. So how are we going to get there? We have a variety of different objectives. First of all, we have a great lineup of speakers that will catalyze discussion, particularly probably in breakout groups and in Q&A sessions. So our speakers are Paul Steblein. Paul will speak to aligning fire science with fire needs. Lenya Quinn-Davison will speak to people and relationships and networking in co-owning fire. Andi Thode will talk about co-production and tools to manage climate change now in the Southwest fire climate. Next, please. We also have lightning speakers. These talks will be a little bit shorter, but again, they're to catalyze discussion. John Abatzoglou will discuss climate tools for Southwest forests. Michele Crist will discuss altered fire regimes and wildfire management in sagebrush ecosystems. Hugh Safford will discuss new tools, methods, partners for chaparral sustainability. Carolyn Enquist and Molly Hunter will address post-fire management in a Sonoran Desert-Montane ecotone. And lastly, Nikki Cooley will talk about climate change, ecoculture for Southwest Indigenous communities. So our speakers will touch upon both natural and cultural resource assessments for planning in uncertain futures. Next, please. Well, how do we get it done operationally? We'll use Menti, we'll use polling. First, to get a handle on the affiliations that our attendee composition, our affiliations, what you want to walk away with in the meeting, and we'll do that shortly. But also we'll use polling in Q&A for our panelists, and at the end, post-breakout group. Next, please. Also, we have breakout groups, and I'm excited for the breakout groups. These are by bioregions, and we're going to use the digital whiteboard mural. It's a brainstorming activity. And in this brainstorming activity, we want to get a handle on 3 questions. And those questions are, what major climate wildfire changes are expected to affect fire management in your bioregion? What tools, data are needed to address those changes? And lastly, how do we facilitate generation of new tools and science and integrate them into fire management? On the next slide, I want to take a closer look at that mural board. Stace? So when you go into Mural, you'll have a link. Jeannie will supply the link to get into your bioregion. You'll find your group. This is just group 1. You'll see the 3 questions there. The questions here in my slide are abbreviated. Climate wildfire changes that we're expected to see in the bioregion, the tools and the science needed, and then lastly on the far right, facilitate and integrate into fire management. And so what you'll do is you'll write down your ideas and thoughts on these sticky notes. And we have facilitators that will help keep things moving. A friend of mine called these not facilitating, but corralling, because this is pretty loose. It's not highly structured. We want free thought to flow. So the facilitators will help keep things moving. And lastly, they'll help with some of the easy mural questions. And Ginny will have a brief tutorial on mural as well. And I want to give a shout out to our reporters, Karina, Andrew, Julie, Leah, Katie, and Julie. Thank you for reporting out. Facilitators will not be reporting out. Next, please. And by meeting's end, I hope we can achieve these things, that we've identified fire management and science needs. We've provided an awareness of tools needed for decision making. And hopefully we've discussed if current tools are robust enough for future conditions. We've generated novel science actions to meet fire needs for practitioners and planners in future non-analog landscapes. And hopefully, particularly during the breakout groups, we've suggested how we can accomplish identified needs and integrate them into management. And again, lastly, we've made some connections today. Last slide, please. Our end game here is that after the meeting, we hope to post the recording of the meeting and a summary white paper on the Great Basin, California, and Southwest fire science exchanges. Some of you may not be aware of the fire science exchanges and what they do. I know some of you are, but I want to give a shout out to them. They really are communication hubs for wildland fire science, and they network us across agency boundaries. And so I'm really happy now to turn this over to Stacy, who will give a little bit more information and talk about the role of the fire science exchanges. Stace?
All right, hello again, everyone. So I just wanted to do a super quick introduction to both the Joint Fire Science Program and then their fire science exchange networks. I know that's a lot of words and a lot of things, but bear with me here. So the Joint Fire Science Program was started in 1998, so it's been around a long time, and it was a collaboration of a couple different federal agencies that provided funding. And the idea really was that we needed a lot more scientific research on wildland fires. And then more than that, we didn't just need the science, but we needed some kind of distribution method. So it funds both applied science research and the fire science exchange networks. And so what is the Fire Science Exchange Network? If you look at this map here, you can see that there's all these lovely colors, and these are all reflective of these different regionally based exchange networks or consortium. And the idea here is that our fire science needs are different depending on where we are, and so we divided and conquered, but we also work collaboratively, like today, where three of us, the California, Great Basin, and the Southwest are working together for fire science needs. We have numerous partners, not just with federal agencies, but we really try to touch in with everybody who both produces science and uses science. And so now every part of the country is covered by somebody like ourselves. And what we actually do is very diverse, but just some kind of examples. We do a lot of products, so we take journal articles and we write research briefs, or we synthesize so that we can try and make it so that people who are wanting to pick up science can just grab what they need and read it versus trying to sift through all of the research papers out there. We provide more in real-time updates with newsletters and social media. And then we do things like this where we have webinars or have videos. And we also collect research needs and funnel those back up to the applied science side, the Joint Fire Science Program. And I would say that in normal days, what we really look to is activities. Science and management don't get done in a vacuum, it gets done in a partnership. So anything we can do to facilitate networking and connection and collaboration is really, I think, where a lot of our passions lie. So we would do in normal times, and hopefully someday soon, lots of field trips, workshops and conferences, classes, presentations, and really just anything where people are connecting with science, especially out on the ground where we can actually really see what's happening. And that's pretty fast. So I also wanted to point out too that if people were joining late, if you have any technical issues, just giving a shout out that you can private chat to Corey Gucker, to Stacy Frederick, and we can help you with things too. But that's the Joint Fire Science Program and the Fire Science Exchange Network in a nutshell. So Joe mentioned, and you can see in the chat there too, I wanted to take a brief moment and talk about one of the tools we're going to be using today. Rather than using the normal Q&A function for Zoom, we're going to be using Menti. So we're going to practice this now. And I just want to say, so you have two options here. You could open this as a new tab on your computer, or you could also use your phone so you have a handheld device to answer and type in questions, or you can do it on your computer. Either way is fine. So whichever you choose, whether that's on a new window or on your phone, you can go to menti.com and then just type in that code. And we're going to go through. And so the idea behind this is that we can do polls, we can do Q&A, we have a lot of different functionality so that we can have a little bit more interactive meeting. So go ahead and go to that and let us know how you categorize yourself. And we'll give it a couple minutes here. And a couple things as we're going through this too with Menti, we're going to be using this throughout the day. So if you want to keep that browser open, it means you won't have to go through and get to the questions that we're on. I would recommend that. Okay, so I'm going to do some commentary. If anybody from my team wants to join on, let me know. But looks like most of us are actually identifying as researchers. So 37 of us, 17 are identifying as managers, and then 12 as practitioners, and 14 as other, which I'd be curious to know what that is. But that's our basics for that. Let's go ahead and go to the next question here. And so on your screen, you can probably see after you've submitted, you probably have the next option. Cooperative extension is what somebody put for other. Yeah, that's actually pretty similar to a lot of us at the Exchange Network. We're kind of in that nexus between researcher and manager or practitioner. So thanks for that note. And then what is your current affiliation? So when we were putting this meeting together, we had a lot of conversations around who we needed at the table. And the idea actually was that we needed a lot of different people, but we're going to start with some of our federal agencies just because of who was sponsoring the meeting. So not surprised there that we have most of us are coming from a federal agency with a couple of people there from state and academics. And then now that we know a little bit of who we are, what is the most important walk away that we're asking for this meeting? And so we gave everybody a scale here to see what they found was more important. And what I'm seeing is that we want a lot of different things from today. It's pretty tied up. I see that make connections is probably a little bit lower, and I think that's mostly a product of the fact that we're doing this virtual meeting, but we're hoping that we can kind of help with that a little bit. And oh, it's close, but it looks like it's a pretty even tie between providing awareness of tools needed for decision making in an uncertain future. Oh, and looks like generating a list of new science actions just took the lead. But right behind is suggesting how we might address and accomplish these needs and exchanging information. So it looks like these are all pretty even on the scale of what we're looking for. So this last one we have is a word cloud. So as you're putting that in there, you're going to see that we had to abbreviate a little bit here because of a character limit. But so hopefully we're thinking for things like research is going to be research for helping with decision making. So pick the one that you feel like's the most, and we're just going to watch it kind of evolve here and see what people are finding is the biggest challenge from that list. Oh, this is so fun. And it was looking like we were getting most people answering these questions, which is good. So I know this is a new tool for a lot of us, but it's pretty intuitive, and we hope that it can kind of give us a little bit of a more interactive kind of Q&A session. We'll also be using this for our presenters. So on the next screen, you're probably going to, after we go through this one, you're going to see wait for the next cue. So this will be our last question from the mentee so far. And Corey, could you go back to that last one to the word cloud if possible? Thank you. I'm seeing the big ones coming out as collaboration, climate change, and community prep. Those are the three biggest ones for me on my screen right now. And then all these other ones are definitely still important to varying degrees. The smallest ones being WUI and targeting, transformation, implementation. But it looks like collaboration, community prep, and climate change. So our 3 C's for the day is what we're gonna be moving forward with that there.
Oh, I like that, the 3 C's. And just an FYI, we had close to 170 people register for the meeting. And so I just wanted to toss that info in there, Stace. Thanks.
Next person we're going to talk about, or we're going to hear from, is Paul Steblein. Paul is the USGS Wildfire Science Coordinator. I've fortunately got to meet him back before COVID days because he also is part of the Joint Fire Science Program's governing board. And he's going to give us a brief kind of crash course on aligning fire science with fire needs. So Paul, when you're ready, let us know.
Thank you, Stacy. So I have 5 minutes and 5 slides, and want to share a little bit about what we learned about aligning fire science with fire needs from developing our strategic plan. Could I have the next slide, please? So one of the big questions we encountered, and still on a regular basis, is do we really need any more fire science? Don't we know everything? We've been studying it 100 years. And there's a couple of factors that weigh heavily, I think, on compelling need for more science. One is we are seeing great advances in scientific understanding, but also technology that let us address questions that we may not have been able to address before, or deal with much more complex issues. The second is that there are factors that create new situations. We've heard a number of times, I haven't seen that kind of fire behavior before, or I did not expect these plants to grow in this location. And what alternatives do we have to address these changing situations? So some of the key drivers that we identified in our strategic plan and in interacting with stakeholders are climate change, both the direct effect on fire behavior, as well as the indirect effect on vegetation and other components of the ecosystem. Invasive species, and we'll hear from Michele Crist later today about cheatgrass and other invasive species that have flipped upside down fire regimes in big sections of the country. Insect and disease outbreaks, such as bark beetles that are affecting conifers that have swept across the country. And certainly human activity out in these wildlands and development, changing the whole distribution of WUI, making it more complicated, and changing the patterns of ignitions of fires. We also encounter cascading disasters. It used to be just fire, but people are finally putting together the sequence of things. Fire is changing the hazards that are out there, such as debris flow, flooding, loss of water, or water quality, or wind erosion, or the ability to gain back, recover the vegetation that's needed for the land uses we have. And then future policy decisions. These are expensive and complicated, and science lets us actually forecast scenarios that look at the implications of the policies and the costs and how much of what is needed. And then finally, all these factors are interacting and making it very challenging to address any one issue because they're so connected. Next slide. By the way, that picture was of Hurricane Michael, the after effects in Florida, snapping off forests across thousands of square miles. So this is an excerpt from our strategic plan, which I hope we get the approval to release soon. But anyways, this is results from interviewing 40 different organizations. And the size of the box and the number reflect the number of responses. And we were trying to understand what are the science needs of the next 2 to 10 years. And so some of it was pretty understandable. And some of the factors that I just pointed out came through on this under priority research needs. So climate change, invasive species, weather, social science, some of the changing human landscape. But one of the interesting sections was a new one on planning for uncertainty. And so there's a number of subtopics here that get to the challenge of dealing with an uncertain future and the need for information and tools to address that. Science practices, so this whole thing of leveraging and working together and other aspects of it, and then data needs and tools were other important segments. Next slide. So under our Wildland Fire Strategic Science Plan, there are 4 priorities that we lined out. The first one, and it's significant, and there's a lot of information in the words that were chosen here, but advanced science integrated across disciplines, missions, agencies, actionable, so that the results can be used for decision making to address the many and varied and dynamic challenges that are out there. Another priority, another section, fundamentally defined sort of a new way of doing science that we'll hear more about today, and that's basically co-production. So engaging with our stakeholders to identify the needs, the science needs, design that science to make sure that it delivers the results and deliver it in a way that it can be used. The third item is communication, making sure that the public knows what we do, where to get the results, and what it means, so translating it. A lot of the people we interviewed knew a little bit about what we did in fire science at USGS, but there are vast areas that were unknown, so that awareness. And then the last one is organizational excellence. So enhancing collaboration within the USGS so that we can more effectively work interdisciplinary across centers, across regions, and across missions. And then with our partners, whether it's Forest Service R&D, the Fire Science Exchange Network, or with the land management agencies. Next slide. And I believe that's my last slide. So I just want to call out at a high level some of the challenges and what that translates to opportunity. So we are talking about massive social, economic, and ecological impact that we've seen from fires this year and a number of years in the last decade or so. When you look at that impact, just economic, it's 75 to $250 billion a year of economic effect. We are under-invested for the science that's needed to deal with that. But we can always leverage, work more effectively together, collaborating to address it. The challenge is complex. It's in a dynamic setting. So science and technology can help us understand better those drivers, reduce that uncertainty, and identify alternatives. So help provide the opportunity for managers to have a better choice of selections for actions that they can do. Third challenge, we're dealing with vast amounts of information. That is one of the byproducts of new technology. And there's many decisions that have to be made in a short period of time. So science and technology can help extract usable information from that data and set it up in a way so that it is readily applied. So you don't have to be a computer scientist to use it. And the last one, we're talking about a complex social and environmental landscape. We have simultaneous disasters such as COVID and fire, or a hurricane that changes the fuel distribution, that changes the fires. And so it is a complex suite of challenges to deal with, but there's a lot of benefits from fire too. To deal with that complexity and that dynamics, we need the relationships ahead of time and the structures that let us define those needs together and can exercise and apply them in advance, prepare for these different kinds of challenges that are out there. And it's not just fire. It is fire, land, emergency managers, community managers, policymakers. And that's it. The title at the top, All Hands, All Lands. It really, what I'm trying to do is say that it's a little bit broader than what was originally identified in the National Cohesive Strategy. That's the model from the strategy. And that's it. End of presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that. And I think that's a really great segue. So your last point there, building relationships. For those of you who know me, I am an extreme extrovert and love meeting and interacting with people. And the best way we could try to mimic that today was to utilize the breakout functions tool. So I know Joe briefly mentioned these, but the idea behind the breakouts is that we're going to pair people into smaller groups based on bioregion. Today it's kind of like the coffee hour. So we're going to meet people, introduce ourselves, and have some introductory conversations. And then after we hear from our amazing setup of speakers and lightning talks, we're going to come back to those same breakout groups and do the mural exercise and really try to work together in these small groups to come up with some of the outcomes for the meeting that we're hoping for.
The first two presentations are going to broadly give us an overview of fire management challenges posed by changing climates and fire regimes and what might be done now to help plan for the future and prepare for the future. Our first speaker is Lenya Quinn-Davison, University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources Area Fire Advisor, Humboldt County, California. The title of her talk is Co-Owning Fire, People, Relationships, and Networks Are Key to Our Fire Future. You're on, Lenya.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. And good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation to speak. As Matt said, I'm Lenya Quinn-Davison. I'm the Area Fire Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension, based up in the north coast of California in Humboldt County. And I have to admit, when I got invited to speak at this conference, I looked out at the redwoods and the fog, and I kind of wondered what insight I might have to give to an event that's focused on the Southwest, even though I know California is part of the region. Jeannie, you can advance this slide. But last week I drove from my house in Humboldt to Death Valley for a camping adventure with my family in the remotest part of the state. And as I made that drive, you know, I passed through all the different bioregions that we are focusing on here for this event today. And just really thinking about all of you and about this conference and the presentation and how I might be most useful. So just for fun, we can walk through some of the landscapes that I drove through. You can go to the next slide. So I live in the coast and work in the coastal prairies and the North Coast deciduous oak woodlands. And this is really where my fire program is based, is in these systems, trying to restore fire to these places that are really highly departed from their historical fire regimes. And as I drive inland, I go through Whiskey Town, which is the next slide, and the footprint of the Carr fire and the Chaparral and the Mediterranean oak woodlands that are, more typical of the interior areas, and the knobcone pine. And then as I went farther east, going through the Lhasa National Forest, next slide, the pine forests and, the areas around Susanville that burned this summer, and then drop down into the Great Basin with the next slide. And, just seeing all of these systems that are so departed from their historical fire regimes, either with too little or too much or the wrong kinds of fire. And thinking about that broken relationship that these landscapes have with fire, and how that's really a direct reflection of our own social and political broken relationships with fire. So if you advance the slide, the work I do is really less about the specific landscapes and these specific bioregions, although I do some of that here locally. It's really less about the specific ecosystems and more about the people and the relationships and the networks that are making decisions on these landscapes, and how their management's coming to play out. And my work really focuses on restoring those relationships and elevating and supporting the people who are doing innovative things across all of these different places. So today, you can go ahead and advance the slide. Today, I really want to share some examples of my work, and they do tend to be more on the social end of the spectrum rather than the ecological. And really want to talk about how we can support the different people and the different leaders and these different relationships and connections that are able to integrate science with management, and management needs into policy, and community needs into all of that. Because in my mind, the biggest needs that we have as we move forward in this uncertain future really are more subjective and cultural than they are purely technical. And I think we heard Paul talking about that earlier. So I'm going to jump into just sharing some examples of the work I'm doing. And I'll start off talking about prescribed fire training exchanges, which I have the privilege to be involved in and to lead across different landscapes in the country through my work with the Women in Fire prescribed fire training exchanges, and through my leadership in the TREX Coaches Network. So the prescribed fire training exchanges, or TREX events, are a training model that was innovated more than a decade ago by folks within the Nature Conservancy. And at that time, they were really about providing training opportunities as an exchange between federal agencies and the Nature Conservancy. So the Nature Conservancy could provide really quality prescribed fire training opportunities because they have such robust prescribed fire programs across the country. You can hold up there. And the federal agencies could provide TNC with wildfire training opportunities. So there was this direct exchange going on between TNC and the Forest Service in particular on trying to advance qualifications for burn bosses. And that was really where that started. As time moved forward, there was so much momentum and so much interest from a wide range of practitioners and agencies and tribes and nonprofit organizations and different kind of non-traditional fire practitioners, and becoming involved in this kind of training, that vision of what a TREX event looked like really evolved. And in the last 10 years, we've seen it expand to be much broader than just that original focus on burn boss qualification. You can advance the slide. So if you look here on the left-hand side is just the kind of the TREX activity that happened in 2019 across the country. There were 14 different TREX events across 9 different states. More than 500 participants from a wide range of entities were involved in these, and they treated more than 18,000 acres with prescribed fire. And what we're seeing is that these events are popping up everywhere because there's such interest in more cooperative burning, in building capacity outside of just the training opportunities. It's not just about providing training, it's really about developing the administrative infrastructure to enable more cooperative burning. So getting the agreements in place, the MOUs, the different relationships that you need to be able to advance this work. TREX is able to inspire and instigate some of that I know it did in California in 2013 when we hosted the very first TREX event here in this state. It's also about bringing diverse practitioners together. So the TREX events have federal, state, tribal, NGO, private, academic, everyone you can think of is coming to these events and able to work together, learn about the, the ways that they're doing things back home. And that's such a rich learning environment that's actually pretty unique if you think about it in the fire training context. Also experiencing diverse fuel types. So it's really important for folks to burn in different fuel types and to get that experience that's not just, just always the same as their home unit. And of course, always bringing that ecology side and policy and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are focal points of all TREX events, even though it's really a decentralized model that's focused on local needs and kind of local landscapes and issues. We really try to bring the science side and the policy side and that focus on diversity and really rebuilding a better fire culture through these events. So TREX is really exciting in a lot of ways in lifting up and elevating all of those different pieces as part of our fire future. If you go to the next slide. These are just some photos from some of the events that I've hosted, some of the TREX events, and go to the next slide. So the other piece of it that I think is really important is the TREX Coaches Network. So Jeremy Bailey from the Nature Conservancy and I co-lead the TREX Coaches Network, which is a network of all the folks who are organizing and implementing these TREX events all over the country and all over the world. And it's been so valuable to be able to link those folks and provide for that shared inspiration, shared work, helping each other out and really kind of creating this net of innovative prescribed fire activity that's going on all over the country. So I just wanted to highlight some of the types of people who are involved in this network. So on the upper left, you see Will Harling, who is the director of the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. And he's the leader of the Klamath Treks, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and probably been involved in. Will also does a bunch of really interesting work. Right now, he's spearheading some efforts, bringing Susan Pritchard and Paul Hesberg into doing some really neat modeling, landscape scale modeling that could help guide fire management in the larger region around the community where he lives, because he's surrounded by a public landscape and their little tiny private community is nestled in that. And so they're trying to think of ways to have community-based community-based models to integrate cultural burning and the tribal connections in that region. And so really neat stuff going on with Will. Emily Homan, who's in the middle there on the top, she is the director of the Fire Learning Network, and she's the chair of the New Mexico Prescribed Fire Council. And she's a leader of a lot of different TREX events and assists on a lot of different events around the country. She's also a type 2 burn boss and just really a strong fire leader in this whole prescribed fire world, that we're all working in. Kelly Martin on the upper right is the retired fire chief from Yosemite National Park. And she's one of my co-leads on the Women in Fire Training Exchange and doing a lot of neat policy work and kind of education and outreach, both nationally and internationally. On the lower left-hand side is Ben Wheeler. He's with Pheasants Forever, and he works in Nebraska. And he's been able to use TREX as a platform for really inspiring and empowering private landowners in his area to build prescribed fire programs on their properties. And so he's doing some pretty innovative stuff, using TREX more as a jumping off point than as an endpoint. Sasha Berleman in the middle there on the bottom is the director of the Fire Forward program with Audubon Canyon Ranch down in the North Bay area of California. And she's doing some pretty interesting stuff using TREX again as a jumping off point for bringing prescribed fire back into what is a pretty highly urban and suburban part of our state. So just in the last 2 months, she's been doing some really great work down there. And then Bill Tripp on the lower right is with the Karuk tribe. And he's really a national leader on trying to think about tribal sovereignty and cultural burning and how we can bring tribal interest and tribal knowledge into the bigger fire management picture. So he's a strong leader on that. And these are just 6 of 65 TREX leaders that we have that we are networking and supporting and really trying to work with and bring together nationally and internationally. So these folks are doing incredible things and are really on the cutting edge in the prescribed fire world on innovating and thinking about different ways to approach these issues. You can advance this way. Now, the other big thing that I work on is community-based prescribed fire here in California. And I think, on a small scale, the work that I'm doing here is really about empowering landowners to bring fire back into their own toolboxes and to have it be part of their own personal land management, kind of portfolio. But on a larger scale, I think we're really, across California, really trying to empower communities to be more resilient and less reliant on agencies to do this work for them. So, thinking about strategic planning within the community level, not just prescribed fire, but also fuels treatments, how those things all fit together, and really empowering the communities to be more invested in and more active in this work that they haven't been for a long time. For a long time, it's been, kind of outside the realm of the community-based organizations to be involved in fire. And I think that through this work, we're really enabling more creative solutions on the public lands that surround these places. So I see as the communities are more invested, they're more involved, they are also providing more social license and more support and even demanding more action on the part of the public lands. And so we're seeing this kind of shift right now where it's no longer the agency folks who are trying to convince the communities. In a lot of cases, it's communities who are saying, hey, we're ready to be involved in this, we're ready to be leaders in this. When are you gonna let us in? And so it's pretty exciting work that's happening there. You can go for it. So this work does represent a real shift in the West in the way we're thinking about who gets to be part of fire. And I realize that a photo like this, a normal person in normal clothes using prescribed fire may make some people uncomfortable. It really flies in the face of our Western fire culture, which is largely rooted in fire suppression and a really professionalized version of fire. But I think we need to remember that, we have so much to learn from the original fire cultures in the West. And those are the tribes and the ranchers and average people, like what we're seeing in this photo. So it's exciting to think about, how we can move forward and how something like this image can really be at the center of how we think about fire moving forward and how we think about our connection with fire as people who live on these landscapes. And so if you advance the slide, I work a lot currently on policy issues around all of this stuff and really trying to think about the policy frameworks and the kinds of changes that we can make legislatively to better enable and empower this, this work at the community scale. So some of the things that I'm working on right now are certified burner programs. Here in California, we're about to roll out a state certified burn boss program that was mandated by legislation in 2018. And so that's really exciting, but it does have some missing pieces, I think, that are going to be critical to its success. So we're talking right now about, rethinking our negligence laws in California, really trying to tackle some of the insurance pieces that are these huge gaps in how we move forward with prescribed fire. And then thinking about how we are strategic in this work. And it's not just about black acres, it's really about where and when we can be most effective when we're using prescribed fire or any other kinds of fuel treatment. So these policy efforts I see as really central and some of the most powerful work that needs to be happening right now in the context of the statewide efforts that we're leading. And these issues are all relevant across the Southwest. It's not just in California. New Mexico is talking about certified burner programs and negligence laws. And so are many other states across the West and the Southwest. So these are pertinent topics and things that we all need to be thinking and talking about. Do you go to the next slide? So in closing, I just wanted to share something that came to my attention earlier this year and that I really thought was powerful. In fire, we're always talking about increasing pace and scale, and we hear ourselves say that constantly. And I think that we don't always put a lot of care into what we're actually talking about when we say that. So if you look at this came out of a paper you can see down on the bottom, and I recommend looking it up and checking out this little article that came with it. I think we're typically talking about scaling out and scaling up. We're about just doing more of the same, but and doing more numbers, more acres, more projects. But I think it's time for us to think about some of these other types of scaling. And one of the things that I work on a lot, and that you've heard me say several times in this talk, is the cultural aspects. And that number 3, that scaling deep. How are we actually questioning the assumptions that go into this work, the relationships, the cultural values and beliefs? Where, are our hearts in the work we're doing? Does this work matter to us on a personal level? And I think when we can start creating those linkages, those are going to translate into the science and into the policy and into the management. This is all subjective work that is coming from our values and our beliefs and our culture. And I really like 4 and 5, the spree scaling and the scaling initial conditions, because I think it really is about impacting norms and expectations and trying to find a multitude of different small relevant solutions that are at the local level and make sense to the people who live in those places. So that's really important. And then of course, impacting infrastructure and that access to capital, to data, to talent, knowledge, and networks. Who gets to be involved in this work? Whose opinions matter? Whose values are at the heart of the strategies that we're putting in place? So I really like this idea of questioning what scaling means, thinking about, as we say, we're going to increase the pace and scale, really taking that to heart and thinking about what we're saying when we say that. So I hope that's a useful tool for all of you, or at least something to talk about in the breakouts. And with that, you can go to the final slide, and I think I'll wrap it up. And I look forward to interacting more the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Lenya. You may have seen also in everybody in your chat that you're having the opportunity to add questions for any of the speakers during the time that they're speaking through Menti. And there are some other questions that some have entered. So make sure that you keep that window open, and the information's in your chat on the code 2364537. So we have time for a couple questions here. Lenya, can you see the questions there?
Yes, I can. Okay.
You want to pick one?
Sure. Yeah, question about the county map. Yeah, I totally forgot to mention what that was. So the different colors on that map were the different counties where community-based prescribed fire groups are either in formation or have already formed. So if we were to go back and look at that, you would see that there are about 12 different counties where we already have, just in the last 2 years, community-based prescribed fire groups that have formed and are actively burning in those places or are planning burns. And then there are other places where they're either in conversation or kind of in the early stages of development. I would think in the next 5 years, we're going to see community-based prescribed fire groups in almost every county in California, based on the momentum and interest that I've seen. Let's see here. If I wanted to get a Trex going in our region, how would we go about connecting with the Trex leadership to make that happen? If you're interested in that, feel free to shoot me an email, and we can start having some conversations about how to get a Trex going and kind of what that looks like. So yeah, feel free to email me, or you could email Jeremy Bailey with the Nature Conservancy. So you could just Google prescribed fire training exchanges and get either of our contact information. Let's see here. With the advent of bigger, more damaging fires, is there a growing public appetite to learn about fire and tolerance for prescribed fire? Yes, absolutely. Oh yeah, thank you, Stacy, for putting up that PBA website as well. There's so much public appetite for prescribed fire right now. I have to say, this fall, with the fires that were happening in California, I have never seen so much media and public interest in this topic. And I've been working on this for 11 or 12 years, and the interest and the momentum around prescribed fire right now is incredible. And that's why I think we're in a position where we could start pushing for some more radical changes around like negligence laws and things like that, because I think the time is ripe. We've never seen the level of social license as we are right now. Let's see here. What do you view as the biggest hurdle for the community-based groups in getting fire on the ground at the right time and place to achieve fire and resource objectives? So the biggest hurdle, I think, for the community-based groups, there's kind of twofold. I think we have capacity issues. There's a real need for folks in the West to receive training. We've had a gap in in the comfort and the knowledge and the art and science of prescribed fire. So there's a need to provide that training and to rebuild that comfort and culture around prescribed fire. There's also a hurdle, a regulatory hurdle, as far as kind of the discomfort of the fire agencies with the idea of community-based burning. So it's a slow process of trying to build that trust in each local unit and get CAL FIRE on board with the idea that maybe folks other than CAL FIRE can have a role in this. You know, that fire suppression culture is strong, and there's a real ownership over prescribed fire by the fire suppression community. So I see that as one of our really big hurdles, in addition to the capacity issues. Let's see, how much time do we have, Matt?
One more, Lenya, yeah.
Okay, could you elaborate more on how you work with tribes, particularly in the context of cultural burning? Do you see a role for your organization in facilitating the implementation of cultural burning? You know, my work with the tribes has been more on the policy side. I work really closely with Bill Tripp, who I mentioned in my presentation, and with Margot Robbins and a couple other folks from tribes, mainly on policy issues and trying to advocate and be an ally with the tribes in thinking about cultural burning, how we expand, you know, those kinds of things. So I have done some Trex events where I have organized and worked on burns with local tribes, but really it's bigger on that bigger regional scale and being an ally and being an advocate. So that's, I see a role for my organization in helping implement cultural burns, if that's something that's helpful for them and that they come to me for. We haven't had that as much as just my role in helping lead the Trex Coaches Network and supporting the work in that way. So,
great. Thank you, Lenya. There'll be time to ask Lenya and other speakers more questions also during our panel discussion. So we're going to move on to our next speaker. Let's go ahead and get her presentation up. Thank you. Our next speaker is Andi Thode. In addition to being an old friend of mine, she's professor of fire ecology and fire science at the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. The title of her talk is Co-Production of Science and Tools to Help Manage for Climate Change Now, Southwest Fire Climb. Andi Thode.
Thanks, Matt. Like Matt said, I'm at Northern Arizona University. This project is part of a very large group of people and really across managers, disciplines, nonprofits, and academics to be able to get the work done. So that's where I wanted to focus to the start. You can go ahead and switch the slide. Mine's not changing. There we go. I just want to point you to our website because there's a lot more detailed information in here about all the different phases, different presentations, webinars, all the deliverables and things that have been done there. So that's southwestfireclimb.org. You can go to the next slide. This is just an example of our team. We had over 17 co-PIs on this project. And again, crossing the agencies, the manage, the agencies that do research, the academic institutions, and the nonprofits. Go ahead and go to the next one. And I just want to say that this really was a big effort in the idea of doing co-production. So basically the managers and scientists, we all wrote the grant together, we got together and saw the need. Managers and scientists were involved every step. The case studies of modeling and tools involved manager and scientist input and testing. The actual modeling and then also the vulnerability analysis that we did with Megan Friggins involved 2 specific forests and folks from those forests. And then the final stage of our project actually ended up testing our fire climate adaptation menu, which I'll talk about, on something called the KPERP project on the Kaibab National Forest, where they want to try and actually implement climate and fire actions on the ground. And so we were able to do a workshop to help them figure out how they might do that. Next slide. So the overarching goals of this project was to evaluate how fire regimes may shift due to changing climates across the Southwest, to model the potential ecological impact of those changes with treatments, and to establish ways that managers can address these impacts. And we really did this through 4 distinct phases. Next slide. We had a science synthesis phase, and I can never say that in a row, so I'd say that 10 times fast. Vulnerability analysis phase, the climate management modeling phase, and then this fire climate adaptation menu. So I'm going to just briefly run through these 4 different phases and what we kind of got out of those. But first I want to put that into perspective a little bit on the climate adaptation process. So this is straight from Swanston's work looking at climate adaptation, and this idea of this adaptation process to get things to the ground of defining where your project is, what the issues are, assessing your site-specific climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, evaluating your management objectives, given those vulnerabilities and impacts that you believe will happen, and then to identify the solutions or ideas and tactics for putting things on the ground, monitoring that work, and then back into the full cycle. And if you advance one, these are really the points where the Southwest Fire Climate Project comes into play in this adaptation cycle. And so we really, we focused on building that vulnerability assessment, helping with that literature search part and understanding what science is out there. And the modeling to be able to look at what the interactions look like with climate and fire and ecosystems in the Southwest. And then over to number 4, which is identifying those approaches and tactics. We developed a fire climate adaptation menu modeled off what the NIAX group had done before. And we're able to work with that group to be able to do that, and then tested that menu in that workshop to try and help actually get some implementation of climate change and fire practices on the ground. Next slide. Oh, look, I didn't even know I had that. Next slide. So the first phase is this the science synthesis phase, and this required us to go through literature that was pertinent to fire and climate in the Southwest. And so we coded a whole bunch of papers in the Southwest. We did a workshop to try and look at what the needs are surrounding new science and what's known that's not in the literature. We also built this annotated bibliography, which is as a website and also a GTR. So next slide. So this is super scary and ugly to look at on a screen, but it gives you an idea of the complexity of what we're trying to do when we're looking at fire and climate interactions and ecosystem effects. And you know, this is missing fuels should really be a bubble up in the top corner, and some of those arrows should be back and forth. But what I want to point out here is that you can take some different pieces of climate, you can take some different pieces of fire regimes and ecosystem effects, and you can look at how those interact. And what we did is search through the literature to see what we do know about those interactions. Next slide. And that allowed us to create this annotated bibliography. So this is a tool that's out there. It's different than a lot of annotated bibliographies because you can search by those interactions between climate and fire and ecosystems, as well as each of the independent things themselves, climate and fire and ecosystem papers. So check that out. It's searchable online. We also have a GTR that's in process on this annotated bibliography. Next slide. The second phase of the project really dove into this vulnerability analysis, which Megan Friggins with US Forest Service Research out of Albuquerque is really the lead on this piece. And we developed a vulnerability analysis tool for fire, climate, and management in the Southwest. And then we had some case studies in the Jemez Mountains and on the Lincoln National Forest. We had a number of folks sit down and try and work through the tool with us so that we could make sure this is actually applicable and usable by the folks that actually need it. So next slide. Most people probably are aware of vulnerability analyses, but it breaks down the world into sort of your exposure. In our case, this is looking at what are the different climate scenarios. So RCP 4.5, RCP 8.5, basically, do we get really bad? Do we kind of moderately change in climate or not? And then the sensitivity of our ecosystem, our components, so our ecological components and our fire regimes to those changes in climate. And then the adaptive capacity that we have as managers to actually be able to do treatment on the ground And so this whole process you can see is written up in this GTR about how to use this tool, and it's available off our website. Next slide. But what I really like about the idea of the vulnerability analysis is this one is very simple. It's not a big spatial vulnerability analysis. It's a spreadsheet, and it allows you to game what happens with different climate scenarios and different treatment levels. And so you can look at, you know, different vegetation types in one climate scenario. So compare vegetation vulnerability. You can compare your vulnerability across different climate scenarios for the same vegetation type and treatments. You can do different treatments to see how that might affect your vulnerability, or you can do a combination of different climate scenarios, different treatments, and different vegetation types. So I like to think of it as being able to sort of game the system and see what kind of outcomes you might be seeing and where your vulnerabilities lie. And if things are vulnerable across all of those, then those might be really a real major focus of where you'd want to start. Next. So that leads us to the third phase, which was the modeling phase. And this has a paper in Forest that can be looked at. To do the modeling, we consulted with managers on 2 different landscapes to understand what kind of treatment practices and they have planned and what they would like to do, what they felt would make a difference on their landscapes. And the modeling team had some managers involved to try and make sure that the outputs actually made sense. And then we have this journal article. So next slide. The modeling was done, and it's not your typical modeling project in where you do the model in multiple landscapes. We actually had 2 different models in 2 different landscapes that were already calibrated, because the goal of the work was to see what was the information we could get to folks in the Southwest on expected changes in fire and climate. And so we didn't want to spend a lot of time on the calibration parts. We actually wanted to get to the data sections. The scenarios for this in management was a business as usual, so a BAU as we call it, 3 times business as usual and 6 times business as usual. So if we did 6 times the amount of treatments in area and intensity across the landscape, how different is that than what we've been doing, sort of thing. And then the climate scenarios was the RCP 4.5 and 8.5, so what we call a warm, dry, and a hot, arid, along with contemporary climate. Next slide. And I'm only going to give you a real small teaser on the outcomes of this study, but basically what was found is that thinning and burning, which are sort of resistance and resilience strategies, did not prevent major type conversions across the landscape and vegetation, both in composition and biomass. And we saw these changes due to regeneration failure and a loss of biomass. And if you could click again and again, I think. There we go. So the top right corner is showing you changes in species composition in that 6 times business as usual. So the highest treatment in the arid and hot scenario, so a worse climate with the most treatment on the landscape. And what you can see is that light green just basically takes over the dark green. And that's a shift in our species composition from ponderosa pine into gamble oak. We also see the loss of higher elevation Doug fir species, and we see a little bit of an increase in the pinyon pine species and basically maintaining the juniper species. So we see those lower areas. This was on the Jemez landscape on the Kaibab, North Kaibab Plateau, just north of Grand Canyon National Park. We saw the shift not happen as quickly in the 100 years, but we did see a great decrease in biomass, and that's what the figure down below is showing you. The red is contemporary climate, the green is the RCP 4.5, and then this is the worst case sort of climate scenario. And what this bar is showing you is what historical levels of biomass were in Southwest ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forest, sort of gives you a band there. And you can see that treatment really makes no difference in biomass loss across these systems. And that the worst case scenario puts us well below what historic biomass was. So we're basically losing our species and having regeneration failures and losing biomass in our older and our younger cohorts. So this basically leads us to the fact that transition strategies on the ground of looking at how are we going to either delay or more gracefully transfer our systems into new reorganizations of ecosystems with future climates is going to be really important. What it doesn't mean is that resistance and resilience strategies where we try and stall what may happen won't be important. Those are going to be really important in trying to make this fall into a new world a little more graceful. Next slide.
Andi, you got 2 minutes.
Okay. The last thing is this fire climate adaptation menu, and you can go to the next slide. This is based off the idea of the NIAX groups, where they created a menu that's meant to be chosen from, not be prescriptive, for different ways to do climate adaptation on the ground. And there's strategies, approaches, and then down to the tactic level. And these go across these ideas of resistance, resilience, and transition. Next slide. We have created this for fire and climate. It was designed originally for the Southwest, but it really can be expanded elsewhere. But major changes will likely be at the tactic levels. Down. Next slide. And then we tested this at a workshop with the Kaibab National Forest to try and help them implement new practices on the ground. And Grand Canyon National Park is actually now implementing some of these strategies into their prescribed fire plans for Grand Canyon National Park as well. Next slide. So this leads me to my last point. This project, you can get all the information and everything you might need off our website. But this really led me to talking to a bunch of folks and saying, you know, there's a lot of us trying to do similar things. And I called up Carolyn Enquist at the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and said, you know, I've heard about all these different projects, but no one's actually talking to each other. We're kind of all working in parallel. And this is, there seems to be a lot of wasted energy. So next slide. So we are really now focusing energy on developing what we're calling, the name may change, but right now what we're calling it is the Southwest Fire and Climate Roundtable. And what we're trying to do is bring all these different organizations. It turns out the climate groups don't really talk to the fire groups, and the fire groups don't really talk to the climate groups that much, particularly in the Southwest. I don't know how that is all around other places. But we're trying to bring these groups together to basically take parallel efforts and leverage them. So everyone's working on training managers on what, you know, climate 101. What do we know about fire and climate in the Southwest? What do we know about RCPs? All these different things. And so the idea is to get this group together and come up with a better communication structure, be able to leverage our money and our time to be able to actually get more implementation on the ground with agency folks. And these are just some of the partners that we currently have in hand, starting, helping us start to get this group going. And with that, you can go to the next slide. I just want to note that the Southwest Fire Climb was funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. And then you can, I'll leave you with my pretty picture at the end. Which, yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Andi, that was awesome. Can we get the Mentimeter questions up? One question, that's easy, Andi.
Wow. Now I have to read it, it's a long one. What is the window of time that can be modeled with acceptable level of uncertainty? You know, most people say 50 to 100 years, but it depends on the models. It depends what it is you're trying to look at. There's always uncertainty built into these. We have some really good climate folks on board that probably could answer that even better than I could. And then most management is on incremental tactical management. Do you think that longer term modeling may require discussion of long-term management goals for land? Absolutely. The idea behind the modeling in this project was simply to get some information. A lot of other places have had a lot of climate modeling. There's been a lot of climate and fire regime interaction modeling done. So just to get some information out from those models that were already existing on the landscapes. And those models were really helpful in the workshop to give managers an idea. I mean, we had a district ranger from the North Kaibab National Forest who basically said, you know what, I these words, resistance, resilience, and transition, and looking at these modeling results where we are definitely headed into transition, you know, these aren't words that we use. These aren't words that our public knows. Not only do we need to be talking to our public about it, but we need to be talking to our folks about it and integrating this into what we're doing on the ground in our fire management programs. So to me, you have to have the managers sitting at the table while you're looking at this modeling to really be the most helpful that it can be. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, I actually have another one, Andy. I may have missed it, but what range of vegetation fuel types have you been modeling? Is it all forested? Is it all fire adapted? Are there any lower elevation?
This project focused more on forested, but woodland and forests. So that is the primary thing, but the vulnerability analysis is really, at this point, a ponderosa pine and xeric to mesic mixed conifer vulnerability analysis, but it sets up the framework to be able to move into other vegetation types relatively easy. So what we tried to do is build these things so that they could be adapted as needed.
Right, awesome. Okay, looks like we're right at 10:30. Joe, are you gonna break in now and send us off to the break?
I am, but one thing I'd like to do is we're going to come back in 10 minutes, gang.
Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to be transitioning into a period of 5 lightning talks, purpose of which is to give catalyzed discussion into the 5, or I should say the 3 bioregions that the breakout groups are organized within: Western Forest, Desert, and Mediterranean. The speakers were asked to briefly address issues such as major climate wildfire changes, which are expected to affect fire management in the region, providing examples of effective decision-making tools that might help prepare, list some fire science needs, or offer other suggestions on how to facilitate the generation of key science in these regions. The 5 speakers will each have 5 to 7 minutes. And then at the end of these 5 presentations, we'll be doing a panel discussion, which will also include Lenya and Andi. Remember, during the talks, you will have time to go to Mentimeter and or menti.com and enter your questions for the speakers as well, that we'll be able to draw upon during the panel discussion. So our first speaker is John Abatzoglou, Associate Professor in Management of Complex Systems, School of Engineering at University of California, Merced. Title of his talk is Climate Tools for Fire Management in Southwest Forests. John Abatzoglou.
Great, thanks, Matt. So if I go over 5 minutes, I get struck by lightning. That's how it works.
We'll just unhook your connection. That's right.
There we go. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the role of climate influencing fire in forest systems, although I'll caveat that with saying that a lot of these tools here are applicable to other systems. And just to preface this, I'm one of these climatologists, right? So I sort of view things and approach things from looking at a top-down angle. So most of my focus here is going to be on the attributes of weather and climate that influence fire events, fire seasons, fire regimes. But I'm glad that we're sort of convening here and bringing together a consortium of sort of views because we have a very complex topic that we're trying to address. Let's go forward to the next slide. Okay, yeah, so this is sort of a very simple way in which at least I view sort of these fire regimes. In that, in a natural setting, we have ingredients for fire, including essentially the fuels, having those fuels be dry enough, having ignition sources, and at least we can view climate influencing all 3 of these, right? The direct way in which really climate is influencing fire, and this is probably even more important in sort of the more mesic systems, is through the drawing effect on fuels, right? The drawing down of fuel moisture and leading to these periods where fuels are very flammable. And if we go to the next slide, we of course have to acknowledge that we have a lot of other things that are going on. We can keep clicking on this a few times, keep clicking. These are all the variety of ways in which of course humans have altered these systems through land management practices, through fire suppression. We ignite the landscape as well. We have the introduction of invasive grasses. And then of course we have climate change, and there's an obvious challenge in trying to decouple these factors. So what I'm going to focus on here primarily is that direct pipeline between sort of the drying effect of the atmosphere through this fuel aridity term on fire activity. And if we go to the next slide, we can sort of highlight how this plays out. Oh yeah, research gap, right? And so this is one of the things that we do really want to tackle. We have seen escalating fire impacts, negative fire impacts in recent fire seasons. 2020, of course, is a very frequent reminder of this. And the goal is not necessarily to have no fire, it's really to lessen the negative fire impacts in what is a hotter and drier future. That is what we're heading into. We're already into it. So we'll go to the next slide here. Right, and this is just to highlight that climate is the interannual enabler of forest fire extent. Okay, and this operates on large spatial scales. Right, climate is a top-down driver or enabler of fire. When we look at the Western United States as a whole, we can explain around 3/4 of the year-to-year variability in burned area. And likewise, when we look at individual regions in California, or if we look at other, even globally, that bottom figure there is just showing that this sort of is a universal driver or enabler of fire activity. At the same time, we know that we have fuel dependent relationships. We have a very strong link right now between how dry fuels are in the summer and how much fire burns at large extents. And I think our goal is to flatten that curve out. So let's go to the next slide. What I want to do next is just highlight 3 tools that I've been involved in, that some of these, and I'll provide links to them later on here. Some of these are basically tools that we've been working with to sort of address a number of climate challenges, both observational, seasonal forecast, and then climate projections. I'm going to focus primarily on climate projections here. So one thing we have is a climate mapper tool in the climate toolbox, and we have a few different variables in there that relate to effects of fire, or sort of potential drivers of fire, right? So we have a tool in there where you can go and look at the projected changes in some of the fire danger indices. So this is just showing us here a map and then a time series for a location here, Yosemite National Park, that shows us the projected number of days where we might have the 100-hour fuel moisture below the 3rd percentile, right? It's sort of those high fire danger days, and how those may change going forward. And you certainly have a lot of uncertainty, but the lion's share of the models are suggesting a substantial increase. So we'll go to the next slide here. Another thing that we've been working on, and this relates maybe a little bit more to sort of post-fire environments that are of course important. And one thing I saw mentioned is the idea of no analog conditions. So we're working on a tool that allows us to sort of think about space for time substitutions in a climate sense. So in other words, we've all sort of, I think, thought about this, right? We want to know, what a landscape may look like in the future, and can we actually find a landscape today that might look like that? From a climatic sense, this is somewhat challenging, right? If you do it just for temperature, you're going to get a different story than if you do it for precipitation. So what we've been doing is actually looking at a consortium of variables that we think represent a lot of the biophysical properties for sort of vegetation. So this is, for example, the north rim of the Grand Canyon. This is showing us here on the left and on the right where you'd have to go today to find a climate that might be similar to the north rim of the Grand Canyon when the world reaches 2 degrees pre-industrial, and then hopefully not when the world reaches 4 degrees pre-industrial. And the idea is that you start to see limiting areas where you have analog conditions. So this is a tool that we're working on, and you can sort of, I'll again provide some links to this shortly.
You're at 5.5 minutes.
Okay, and I'll end with this slide here. And this is also thinking about sort of actions that we can take. So we're starting to begin to map out some of these prescribed burning windows, looking at prescription criteria, where those windows exist today and how they've changed and where they may change moving forward. So I'm going to end there and hand it back over.
All right, thanks, John. Remember, put your questions for all the speakers in menti.com as we go along through here. Next speaker is Michele Crist, Bureau of Land Management, Fire and Aviation, National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. Title of her talk is Altered Fire Regimes and Wildfire Management of Sagebrush Ecosystems.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm just going to jump right into this. So our current wildfire trends in sagebrush have changed significantly over the past 2 decades, where we are now burning as much in these systems as we are in forested systems. And this map here shows different sagebrush communities in green, and the fire perimeters are dark red, that are fires that have burned in sagebrush, and the orange are fires that have burned in other vegetation types, primarily forested landscapes. So just over the past 19 years, we have lost over 15 million acres of sagebrush, primarily in the Great Basin, portions of Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho. We are now seeing large fire sizes of 100,000 to over 400,000 acres that are becoming more common. And we've seen an increase in fire spread and extreme fire behavior. And next slide, please. So historically, fire cycles were highly variable across the sagebrush biome, where fire return intervals could range from several decades in colder, moisture, higher elevations to hundreds of years in the hotter, drier, lower elevations. And these cycles had a very large influence on landscape structure that were dominated by dense sagebrush. Our contemporary fire cycles have changed substantially from these historic trends. Fire cycles in lower elevations, we see return intervals that are much shorter and don't allow time for full recovery. And this is due to the issue of wildfire and annual invasive grasses cycle. We now see reburns on an average of every 7 to 15 years in these areas. Fire cycles in the higher elevations, however, have changed, but not to the same extent. There's been a shift towards smaller and less frequent fires due to successful fire suppression efforts, as well as human development and past grazing that has influenced our fuel connectivity in these areas. Next slide. So the figure on the left was developed by Jones et al. In 2019. It depicts how the distribution and cover of annual invasive grasses have increased from 1990 to 2018 due to warmer temperatures and weather patterns. And this invasive spread and then interaction with fire has created these large expanses of cheatgrass monocultures across the Great Basin. The figure on the right represents the change in the proportion of shrubland and grassland over a 100-year period. The picture on the top was taken in 1901. The picture in the middle was taken in the same spot in 2008 and is now a cheatgrass monoculture. The graph at the bottom just shows the proportion of shrubland versus grassland over the past 12,000 years and how that proportion has changed since European settlement. Next slide. So these are some just different impacts of the altered fire regime for sagebrush. And these include increased risk to human life and property, high fire management costs, and loss of cultural and economic resources. In addition, there's many wildlife population declines. An example is greater sage-grouse, largely due to sagebrush loss and fragmentation due to fire. Next slide. So one tool for managing fire is the science framework, part 1 and part 2. And this framework uses the concepts of resilience and resistance as a strategy for prioritizing wildfire management at multiple scales. So at a broad scale, we can distinguish between sagebrush communities at risk to fire and their capacity to recover from fire and resist annual grass invasions. We can use this information in fire risk assessments to prioritize areas for wildfire management and then determine the most appropriate types of actions for wildfire suppression operations, fire prevention strategies, vegetation and fields management, and post-fire recovery. Next slide. So one of the biggest challenges we have for wildfire management in sagebrush is that we have a culture that's really focused in on forest fires. So our current policies are focused on forest fuel reductions, and they don't address the large percentage of fires that are occurring in our shrubland grassland communities, especially on Department of Interior lands. Other challenges include the public's understanding of fire, is that past fire suppression resulted in the fires that they see today. So they're not aware of other causes of uncharacteristic fires. Our media portrays fire through more of a reactive lens with a focus on images of forest fires. Human ignitions continue to be high, ranging from 31 to 97%, depending on location. And our fire research has been driven by the Forest Service, who really largely focuses on forest fires in their areas. Next slide.
You're at 5 minutes, Michele.
Okay, so my last slide. So these are just opportunities for addressing this culture, which is really just an integration between state and federal invasive programs and wildfire management programs, just to really help elevate this issue of non-native invasive annual grasses and wildfire. And then I'll just mention here a few research gaps. One is a sagebrush ecosystem successional trajectories after disturbance. We don't have a lot of information on this. And also just large scale effective invasive reduction methods. And so I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele. Our next speaker is Hugh Safford, Regional Ecologist for USDA Forest Service Pacific Southwest Region and Research Faculty in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, University of California, Davis. Title of his talk is New Tools, Methods, and Partnerships for Chaparral Sustainability.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, Janine, next slide. I got a sprint on this one. Basically, the major source of ecosystem degradation in Southern California is incessant burning. This is a famous photo of John Keeley standing in the footprint of the Cedar Fire, which burned an area that had been burned a few years earlier by the Viejas Fire, which burned an area burned by the Laguna Fire in the 1970s. And the point to be made by this is that once you have a landscape that's burning at fire return intervals less than about 15 years in Chaparral, you'll lose a lot of your woody cover long term. Next slide, please. So this is a map of time since last fire in the Los Angeles and San Fernando basins and some neighboring basins. Basically, the point to be made here is that very little of the natural landscape around LA has not burned in the last 20 years. I threw in a couple of this year's fires to show that some of those rare landscapes that haven't burned in the last 20 years are burning now. Okay, next slide, please. So a picture at the top left represents an example of what we might call a reference system when we think about restoration. This is a system with dense, tall shrub cover. In this case, it has some serotinous conifers, knobcone pine in this case, inserted. Canopy is closed. There's very high woody fuel loading. There are a lot of specialized species highly dependent on fire. Very few exotic species in the system, and it burns about every 30 to 100 years at high severity. Not a good place to burn homes, build homes, but of course we built millions in these ecosystems, millions. Bottom right is a better example of what the current ecosystem looks like in a lot of the Southern California foothills, where large areas are converting to grass and herbs. Obligate seeding shrubs and serotinous conifers are threatened by frequent fire that's so frequent that they can't generate a sufficient seed pool to stay in the landscape. You've got a more open canopy. Fuel loading is very high in the fine live fuels and fine dead fuels such as grasses, which has raised fire hazard a lot. Exotic species are dominant on a lot of the landscape. Burning is happening about every 5 to 30 years. And of course, there are all sorts of other degradation factors as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the future, a lot more of the same. This is just an example of an older model. This was the MC1 platform in a couple of the Lenya papers 10, 15 years ago. There are some newer models that show similar outcomes. But basically the point here is that the orange is shrubland, and in the Southern California coast and Southern California foothills and mountains, we're looking at loss of most of shrubland cover and massive increases in the amount of grass, largely invasive exotic grasses. Next slide. So I'm just going to summarize relatively briefly some of the efforts that we've been making in the U.S. Forest Service to conserve and sustainably manage chaparral in Southern California. Next slide. We have this thing, next slide please, Ginny. We have this thing called the Chaparral Symposium that we hold about every 3 years. It attracts about 200 managers, scientists, academics, the public, NGO staff, researchers, etc. We focused on restoration in 2013, ecosystem services in 2015, global change in 2018, and we are currently planning the 2021 version. We'll see if we're actually able to pull that off. It might have to be a virtual thing. Okay, next one, thank you. We are also carrying out an ecosystem service assessment for chaparral-dominated landscapes in Southern California. This is a collaboration between a whole bunch of different partners. One of the purposes is to increase the public's understanding of a landscape that they tend not to value very highly, but it's also to provide a framework to estimate the impact of fire on ecosystem services, the impact of climate change on services, and also to help managers identify trade-offs and impacts of their activities. Okay, next. So we have a prototype EcoServe tool. It's not online yet. We're still working with the programmer on this thing. Okay, next slide. And we've been using a means-ends framework to set this thing up. So we basically determined what are the key impacts: disturbance, climate change, activities, for example. What are the resources that they affect, and then how are ecosystem services impacted by those impacts on those resources. Next slide. So this is an example. Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, so if you were to take impacts of wildfire on Chaparral, for example, we have different ecological measures we can make, and then they impact certain ecosystem services. We can measure change in those services. And then at least in a lot of those cases, we can actually develop an economic valuation. Okay, next slide. Some of the impact, I think you can skip this one. Just want to note that we had a lot of stakeholder workshops and we've been heavily engaged with the public on this process. So we can now map carbon storage. Most models suggest there's no carbon in Chaparral. We know that's not true. We've mapped biodiversity replaceability. We can map sediment retention, erosion reduction, and also model how that changes under climate change. Next slide. We have been able to map ecosystem services in general. So we have like ecosystem service hotspots. We've also have a recent publication where we look how climate change may affect those. Next slide. We can carry out natural resource damage assessments. In this case, we're looking at carbon changes in the perimeter of the slide fire from 2007, and then we can use social cost of carbon or other valuations to get a feeling for actual economic impact. Okay, next one. And then, yeah, a lot of reports and pubs. Okay, next slide.
You're at 5 minutes, Hugh.
Thanks, yep. We also have a post-fire restoration planning tool. I saw that Nicole Molinari is on the call. She's a main driver in this project. We're working with a bunch of partners in the US and also with a couple of universities in Spain. The idea is to assess regeneration capacity of Chaparral after fire, to ID areas that are degraded, ecologically speaking, and also to prioritize restoration areas. Next slide. So this is the workflow. Basically, we start with an estimation of the expected regeneration rate based on the shrub regeneration syndromes, i.e. proportions of obligate cedars, resprouters, and facultative cedars. Then we can modify that based on fire history, drought severity, grass competition, things like that. We get a map of regeneration potential. And then we can also add to that a map of erosion potential from the universal soil loss equation. And we can get a map of degradation risk. Thank you. Yeah, the next slide shows those maps. Okay, next slide. And then we can actually combine the EcoServe and PrEP outputs. For example, you can look at priority areas where we're worried about regeneration capacity and then look to see where we can get the biggest bang for the buck from the standpoint of ecosystem. All right, next slide. And then this is my last slide, I think. We've also got a post-fire restoration framework that we've developed in the ecology program that I manage in California. That thing's in press, should be out any day. And this is a good time to have this because we've got about 4 million acres to deal with this year in California. Guiding principles are to restore key ecological processes, consider landscape context, promote biodiversity, sustain ecosystem services. It includes a prioritization approach for how and when and where to conduct management interventions, and it incorporates climate change adaptation. I think that's it. 7 minutes on the money. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Nice job, man. Awesome as usual. Next speaker, Carolyn Enquist, U.S. Geological Survey, Deputy Director of the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and Adjunct Assistant Professor in the School of Natural Resources, University of Arizona. The title of her talk is Climate Change Implications for Post-Fire Resource Management in a Sonoran Desert-Montane Ecotone, Considerations from the Bighorn Fire.
All right, thanks so much. Really appreciate the invitation to be with you here today. I want to acknowledge Molly Hunter, who is also a co-author on this. So next slide. So in the Sonoran Desert, our key climate concerns revolve around just these hotter, drier conditions. We have arid adapted species, but really we don't know, like, what's the threshold? What sort of adaptive capacity do some of these species really have in the long run with hotter, drier conditions? Loss and degradation of water resources. These are really exacerbated by post-fire, post-storm erosion events and impacts on water quality and quantity. And then the introduction of fire into this non-fire adapted system. This is really driven by non-native grasses that were originally planted as forage or ornamentals. And basically they serve as a conduit for fire into the Sonoran Desert. We also get the grassland ecotone just to the higher elevations, acting as sort of a portal for montane fire as well. Next slide. So in June 2020, we had the perfect firestorm in Tucson, Arizona. Basically, in our Catalina Mountains that are just north of us, we had very, very dry spring, dry conditions over 80 days without rainfall. Lots of fine fuel had built up, but just enough rain, because of that rain, just enough rain to drive some of that fine fuel growth. And of course, most of that was in the native and non-native species. So we had in June this fire that was ignited by dry lightning in these early monsoon days. It spread very, very quickly, grew to over 119,000 acres in 26 days. And you can see in this fire progression map here that the Catalina Mountains are basically a sky island with Tucson just to the south, really coming right up to the edge of the mountain range, and some of the neighboring communities up to the west and all around. So you have human communities bordering around this entire region. So basically we had, not surprisingly, evacuation orders across 2 counties and over 80 miles of urban interface. But we got lucky and there were no deaths, only minor injuries, no structures were burned. But really what this made us aware of is that this was a wake-up call. It could be much different next time. Next slide. So the implications for management, it's pretty clear that climate change will continue to exacerbate many of these hotter, drier conditions, as well as the growth and dispersal of fine fuels, particularly these invasive grasses, such as bufflegrass. And this also drives a lot of drought stress in the vegetation around us. Even in arid adapted species, there's some evidence that's growing that there are thresholds. And we've also seen some mortality events as kind of evidence of that. It's also clear that in order to get a handle on some of this, that we need cross-jurisdictional and coordinated fuels reduction programs. In the Sonoran Desert, this really includes year-round invasive removal and control, whereas in the grasslands and up into the Catalina Mountains here, into the ecotones that surround the Sonoran Desert, we need to be looking more at cool season prescribed burning and some of the thinning. And then in addition to consideration of strategic fire breaks. Next one. And we realized too that the water resources are really in the system where water is sort of the lifeblood of the Sonoran Desert. They are at increased risk of post-fire flooding and debris flows. And this need for cross-jurisdictional watershed planning is something that has become more apparent in recent years. And in fact, we've got some great collaborative groups that have emerged. But by doing it this way, we've been able to also sort of start identifying some site-specific actions to slow flows and improve stream bank integrity. Next slide.
You're at 5 minutes, Carolyn.
Okay, key takeaways. Sonoran Desert is not fire adapted, yet it's increasingly an issue in our local communities, both human and natural. The good news is that already our public values have evolved. People get that the desert is important, and forests can serve many uses, but also serve as refuges for people and critters. And we have this evolving perception of fire, the good, that it's necessary in certain systems, not so good in others. And then you have, in these ecotones particularly, this really ugly sort of complex situation where we have to balance many values. Next. So it's really critical to involve the community, to educate create buy-in, and consider these kinds of lessons that we've learned from the Bighorn. And last is it. Well, be prepared for the next one is really kind of the final question that we'll be asking ourselves. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Carolyn and Molly, for that presentation. Our last speaker is Nikki Cooley, Co-Manager, Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, Tribal Climate Change Program. Title of her talk is Climate Change, Ecoculture, and Resilience for Southwest Indigenous Tribal Communities.
All right, thank you, Matt. Yat e she Nikki Cooley dashijine. Kenya ani nishlon look at the net bashish chin as a tlana e dashinale. Twahead line e dashiche. Hot awe the net son nishle. I introduced myself as a Navajo woman. I come from Shanto and Blue Gap. I reside in Flagstaff. I'm of the Towering House clan and I'm born for the Reed People clan. Maternal grandparents are of the Water That Flows Together clan. Paternal are Many Goats clan. So this is how I always introduce myself to anyone that I'm speaking to. So as Matt said, I'm one of the program managers for ITEP's Tribes and Climate Change program. Before I move on, I would like to honor my team, who's shown on the next slide. It's a group of women, very powerful women who work with me, alongside me, working with tribes across the country, including Alaska, specifically on climate change adaptation. And now we're slowly moving into tribal hazard mitigation planning. So we work with tribes to find the resources so they can utilize it to create really amazing adaptation plans that include their culture, their language, and their perspectives. And our end goal really is for tribes to have a place not only at the table, but also be part of the decision-making process in any sector of environmental management. And so when I was thinking about what I should talk about in these 5 minutes, I have about 3 minutes left. On the next slide is that we, Indigenous people, Native Americans, have a non-linear relationship with the environment. And so we think of all the resources as our relatives. Water is life, Mother Earth. Father Sky, and then animals are our relatives. So that kind of drives our resilience from time immemorial, since we were created by the holy people, is that we have that reciprocal relationship. The previous speakers were talking about co-production of knowledge. We have been doing just that for a long time. And on the next slide, I want to mention that a good visual that we use for our people and for anybody actually is this really good visual up here about the caribou had the natural barriers, the usual barriers to worry about. And then with the Industrial Revolution, with the onset of colonial settlers on the new lands, came development, technology, more diseases, so they had a lot more to worry about. And then to now, climate change is in the play now. It's like, where did the caribou go? Us Native people, we can't follow the caribou anymore because they are crossing borders that we are not allowed to cross and whatnot. So there's a lot of difficulty in that. And in the next slide, just keep pressing it until the quote comes up, is that part of that resilience and the adaptation that we have been so a part of for thousands of years is my good friend Celso Villegas from the Tanaatam Nation in southern Arizona said, as Native people, we have always adapted. Now we have to adapt even quicker. But through all of that, we have that traditional knowledge that we rely on, the cultural technologies like dry farming, reducing livestock, harvesting sparingly, but also going back to the permaculture that we were raised with. And on the next slide, there's many plans. There's about 60 plans or so out there. And these are some from the Southwest, the Navajo Nation Adaptation Plan. The Ute Mountain Ute just came out with their action plan. The Campo Band in California, La Jolla Band of Los Sueño Indians, and so on. These adaptation plans are actually involving, including, inserting, and highlighting language, culture, and their cultural perspectives. And they're including how climate change is impacting their ceremonies, the flora, the fauna, you know, our relatives. And these plans are saying that humans are not superior, but rather we are inferior to nature. And that all plays into the resilience and the adaptation of our people. And so on the next slide, my last slide, resilience. So a lot of our adaptation plans are trying to bridge that. I think someone said that there's a broken relationship. I think it was Lenya that said the broken relationship. And we're trying to bridge those relationships between traditional indigenous knowledge and with the Western colonial-based knowledge that I grew up with in the forestry school. And it's written in our own language from our own perspectives. And I just want to close out with that part of our tribe's resilience is we have gone through the long walk. We have gone through corporate takeovers, trail of tears, livestock reduction, and so on. But yet we're still here because we use that philosophy of all the environment is our relation, and we are co-producing. And you know, fire, we talked a lot about fire today. They are our relatives. And so we kind of use that philosophy going into a lot of our work. And I'd like to leave you with that picture. There's a lot of kids that are on there using their traditional knowledge, and that's what keeps us going today. So with that, thank you, and I'll hand it back over to Matt. Thank you for your time. Yeah.
Thank you, Nikki. That was fantastic. We're now going to have an opportunity to ask additional questions of all the speakers. We have 25 minutes until 11:40. So I'd like to invite all the speakers, including Paul, Lenya, and Andi, to join us via turn your video on, unmute yourselves, unless you have background noise. And then we'll get some of those questions back up from the Mentimeter, I believe. And then from 11:40, 11:50, we'll have a break before we actually break off into our breakout groups. And I'll just remind you that the purpose of all these talks, including these panel discussions now, are to provide fodder for discussion within the breakout groups, which will be the real meat of what we want to get to in terms of our discussion, and then the report outs from those groups. So we'll go ahead and get to some of these questions. Let's go ahead and invite any of the speakers if you want to grab any of these questions and address them.
John, let's start with you. I see one in the upper left-hand corner, the analog question.
Yeah, so the analog explicitly just for climate conditions. So thinking about a consortium of climate conditions, climate variability, and looking for similarities in the landscape. So implicitly might include, we have the idea here that climate is fundamentally shaping some of the ecological systems, but it's not going to account for other attributes in there.
Michele, why don't you tackle that middle one?
So would increasing the success native plant seedings be a research gap in recovering sagebrush? Yes, I would say definitely that is another big research gap. I just didn't have time to go over quite a number of research gaps that we have in these sagebrush ecosystems. So definitely it would be. Do you want me to go ahead and answer the next question?
Go for it.
Okay, so I mentioned a science need on post-disturbance of sagebrush trajectories. Are such large-scale, long time frame questions amenable to use of past satellite imagery, AI, ML, or similar techniques, or are they too fine scale or complex? I think my answer to that would really be a yes and a no. Yes, they would definitely be helpful in identifying sort of those changes that are happening over time, especially under these new climate change scenarios. At the same time, what we don't have is a lot of information of just what that natural trajectory used to look like, to be able to even compare it to, just to be able to identify which trend we are actually on and can track. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Carolyn, do you see that question? Are there any practical invasive species removal methods for the use in the Sonoran Desert that won't harm native species and are socially acceptable?
Yeah, that's a real hard one. It's been a real challenge, and it really takes a lot of community organization, quite honestly, to do anything that's really, that broadcasts either an herbicide or what have you. You really do sort of endanger. I mean, there are some claims that it doesn't really affect, but generally this is a manual labor sort of endeavor, and one of the reasons why certainly you want to engage the broader community and local homeowners associations, individuals, the public, get folks out together to do some of these removals that really make a difference. There is some spot treatments, obviously, but it really is a confounding thing. There's no hammer. It's got to be a more precise sort of method, unfortunately.
Yeah. Nikki, do you see that middle question?
Yes, I do. I wonder if that's from Neil Chapman, but if not, that's a great question. I think one of the most culturally appropriate ways to involve tribes in any processes, collaborative processes, is to build a trustworthy relationship, and also to be mindful of the past, of how tribes' voices and actions were not only suppressed, but are still being left out of the conversation. It's insane to really think that this shouldn't be happening, but really tribes are not included. We're always just boxes that are checked off. And also involving key players, influential people in the community other than leadership. But also organizations, like ITEP could be kind of that bridge to connect, help build that relationship. But also the Southwest Cask has a tribal climate liaison. Her name is Althea Walker. She could be one of those that could help start those conversations, and she covers all of the Southwest. So that's a really good question. I can answer some of the other ones too.
Go for it, Nikki. You're on a roll, Nikki. Go for it.
Thank you. Okay, let me answer the short one. Your team appears youthful. Yes, we are. Is your approach that combines modern and traditional knowledge generally embraced by older tribal members? Is our approach? Yes, very much, because ITEP created this Tribes and Climate Change program with tribes specifically in mind. We always say we work for tribes, with tribes, not the other way around. It's not for our agenda, but for theirs. We have an adaptation toolkit that tribes can use, and it specifically has tribal language and how tribes we know how tribes work. We know that you need to go through certain processes to get something accomplished, even to get a project involved or approved. And yes, we always encourage that elders are involved, the youth are involved, everyone is involved, and it's very much so that we try to combine them. I mean, that's what our elders always say, is that modern and traditional knowledge, there has to be that bridge, and we have to walk that fine line without giving more attention to the other and leaving the other one out. It's a really good question. Yes, and my team is all women, and it's not for the lack of trying to get a male in the group. It just happened that way, and we have a really great team. Let's see, and that the other question, tribal perspectives on relationship between people and land resources is certainly different from most agency resource management approaches. Any thoughts on whether that requires that we develop different tools? I don't know if you necessarily have to develop different tools. I would recommend just revising it to include tribal perspectives or culturally relevant, sensitive, appropriate information in there and whatnot. So I wouldn't recommend starting from scratch, but rather just improving upon the one that already exists there. So that's a really, really good question. So it's something that we preach also with our adaptation planning, is not to start from scratch, but to kind of insert yourself into an existing one. So good question. So thank you.
There was a sociological question here that I thought was interesting. Thank you, Jeannie. Many of the challenges described today have a substantial social component. Can the panel, and I'll open it up to anybody, but I was actually thinking of Lenya here, to start off. So can the panel comment on the social challenges we're facing and what social science might be useful?
I can take a stab at that. I guess one of the things I think about with the social challenges and some of those cultural challenges that I spoke to in my presentation is that we're so entrenched, I think, in the West in a certain way of thinking about fire and approaching fire-related problems that I think sometimes it's useful. Well, let me give an example. So from when I did my graduate work, a decade ago, I looked at impediments to prescribed fire, and I surveyed the folks who were using prescribed fire and asked them what their biggest challenges were. And as I've matured in my own work, I've started to think if maybe that's not even the right group of people to be asking about that, because they're so entrenched in their own challenges that it sometimes takes looking at it from an outside perspective to see different ways forward that you're not even open to. So I get a little curious about social science that maybe can bridge different regions, different cultural groups, really help us think outside the box about the way that we approach problems and not just always tell the same story from the same set of practitioners who are the ones experiencing and perpetuating the challenges sometimes. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that's fine. I've got a follow-up to that for the entire panel. Many of you have talked about collaboration and working together and the need to do that. And I'm thinking of the various organizations that Hugh is trying to pull together and many of you to get the job done. What are the obstacles? I think first you have to identify what obstacles are out there for interagency collaboration. And then if you want to take it to step two, how do you break those obstacles down? So first, what are the obstacles? Two, how do you break them down? How do we better work together?
You brought my name up, so I'll approach that. I think that a lot of it, and this ties back into the sociological question that you linked to, is that humans are both all of the promise in everything we do, and they're also the things that shoot down everything we want to do on a constant basis. So it really comes down to personal interactions and knowing how to speak to different people and to different groups of people. And I think that, for example, all the people that currently I'm seeing on the screen, I don't see many, I work with all of them, and it's largely because they're amenable to work together. They want to solve problems collaboratively, and they understand the value of doing that. And I think a lot of people don't get that. Zealots in particular can really get in the way of moving forward because they want to move forward too quickly. I know with climate change, there's a real time issue, but unless you've got everyone, or at least a majority of people moving with you, you're not going to go anywhere because people will shoot down everything you want to do. We run into this in Southern California all the time, where no matter how many collaborators we have, if we don't know how to speak to the public about what we think that we want to try to do, experimental or not, then we're done, because it's going to end up in court and the project's just simply going to end either just on its own or by court action. And I think of a couple of great examples of projects that, for example, the Forest Service or the Park Service have both had absolutely, I mean, what I thought were great projects, great ideas, but they just didn't package them right. And they didn't interact with people ahead of time. People got blindsided by the projects and they thought, wait a minute, what is this? And immediately people jumped to the conclusion that it's something nefarious and they're against it. Whereas really, the work really should have happened, but we just didn't know how to interact with the public on it. And in the end, it all comes down to people when you think about it. All of the degradation factors largely are related to people. And the other thing is, I think that we, in the US, maybe we're not there where we used to be so much, but we've always tended to think of some pre-human past as being the proper reference condition. And I think that we're going to have to start getting over that. The rest of the world doesn't have that hang up. When they think about restoring things, they don't know what the pre-human past is because humans have always been there. And in California, we got 40 million counting right now. So you can't make anything work if you can't figure out how to integrate humans into the equation.
Any other members want to comment on that of the panel?
Yeah, if I could add to that, Joe. We all lead busy lives. We're trying to get a lot of work done within the little communities that we have. And one place, the Wildfire Leadership Council, for instance, really focused on the cohesive strategy, and it was focused on fire. And the fire community focused on just fire. But it has dawned over the last few decades that it's a lot more than just fire. And so it's the post-fire environment that when you have debris flows that are wiping out infrastructure or damaging homes and people, or the floods or the contaminants, or again, just trying to recover vegetation, the scope of the problem is very different. It's not just putting out the fire. It is looking at the whole suite. And that opens up a different way to define the problem that a lot more people need to rally behind and understand and come up with ways to address. And so over the last 2 years, actually, the Wildfire Leadership Council has really embraced the post-fire environment as well as the fire environment. And so I think it gets back to defining problems and issues in ways that are inclusive with the stakeholders. I think Hugh explained it very well in terms of tying the people into what's trying to be accomplished. And so defining that problem, including the right people, socializing it, because it's always about communication, and then working together on that shared vision.
I'll chime in a little bit on the question related to what social science might be useful. And I think, on the implementation side of this, we have a lot of science out there. We do have a lot of tools out there. We have a lot of collaborations out there. There's not always enough discussion between the different collaborations and the different groups and the different what do I want to say, like the fire and the wildlife people or the archaeology people or whoever else needs to be involved in these discussions. But what we don't understand, I think, is what the manager on the ground is up against and what are the barriers for them to be able actually to use these tools and implement them. And I think, Desert-Montane has some research that's going to be starting to look at some of those questions. But I think that's a big front for the social science side, is why after, many years now of adaptation menus and pathways and workshops, are we not actually seeing a lot of this on the ground? And I think there's a little deer in the headlights, like, where do we start? How do we do, where are the examples? And I think cataloging the examples, that's starting to happen, but I think that's a big wide open field for the social science realm.
I'll just follow on to Andy's point there. Where do you start? There's lots of tools we have, and I live in the community that's impacted by the Creek Fire, and for the last 5, 6, 7 years, just watching the trees die, pile up, fall down, and create the conditions that led to the biggest single fire in the state's history. There was a lot of frustration that a lot of the work on the Forest Service land wasn't getting done. We, in this conference call, know why. Question is, how can from a community person standpoint, I think a lot of people living out there in these landscapes are asking this, why can't things move forward more quickly? Everybody blames this person or this constituency or that constituency. But in the end, the work's not getting done. Now, the job of the California mid-elevation forest is massive. Similar things are happening in other parts of the West in terms of the dead trees. Anybody out there on the panel have any ideas as to maybe the least path of resistance towards moving things forward?
Well, I think bureaucratic inertia actually is a lot of it, Matt. I hate to say this, but I think that it is politically very difficult for agencies to turn that big boat around and get rolling in one direction, particularly when you're only thinking 15 to 20 years out and when you're talking about forest or national park, management plans. And it's difficult stuff. And I will say one thing is I'm real happy to be living in California these days because this state has got, I think, is politically progressive enough, is experimental enough, and also, well, COVID's kind of put a dent in this, but there's money available. The cap and trade market has provided a lot of money to actually pull off a lot of work at scales that are absolutely impossible in the rest of the Western states. And I think that we're going to be able to show whether or not it's possible to, Lenya had a great graphic on this, but simply to scale up and down and out and all over the place to be able to pull the thing off, because it isn't going to happen in any other Western states, not at the pace necessary. But I think that the engagement that I have with any of the public that lives in the woods, they get it. But what it comes down to is whether or not voters in urban areas, for example, can get over the fact that they really like trees and they don't really want you to cut trees. They really don't like chainsaws and they really don't like smoke, and all that kind of stuff. It's like, wow, okay, well, hopefully this year will provide us, maybe these catastrophic years sometimes can provide just enough impetus to really make a difference, I don't know.
So I just want to add on to that, we'll always have these kind of big, huge bureaucratic challenges, I think, with our agencies and such. But I wonder if there is more investment in the kinds of translational types of people that work sort of at the nexus of this, science to public space. Relationship building is clearly really essential here. And, for so many folks, that's not necessarily part of their jobs. I mean, you could argue that it is, because we enjoy it and we try to make space. A lot of us have really tried to spend more time doing that, but we find that the job is just too big in terms of the amount of time that it takes to build relationships, to develop trust, to really build the kinds of relationships that we need to be making with our tribal partners, for example, as opposed to tribes just being an afterthought. So often in a lot of the work that we do, how do we bring tribes to kind of, front and center? So I almost feel like, perhaps we need, and it's not that we just need to hire a social scientist. And remember that social scientists are, they study people. They have great frameworks that we can learn from. But I do think that it takes a special kind of talent and skill, and clearly Lenya and Christina, who is part of Extension, and some of these roles that are emerging as coordinators to really facilitate these kinds of communications and do the kind of collaboration that takes so much time. I think that would get over the hump a little bit more quickly while we try to do some of these agency big shifts and try to work on policy. But in the meantime, we've got to keep these collaboratives and these conversations alive and well and open and building trust. So.
Yeah, Carolyn, I like what you're saying, and I think Christina and I talk about this a lot. We're good friends, and we're both Extension folks, and I think that is the unique role that Extension serves. And in California, we're having conversations about how to invest more in fire-related positions in Extension. I'm currently the only fire advisor in the state of California with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and that's a problem. We need more people out there. We certainly have other people who work on fire issues, but not who are devoted to it entirely, like I am. So I think Extension's able to bridge that science piece with the policy and the landowners and the agencies in ways that no one else really can.
Yeah, I would add to that as well. You know, I mean, I was just thinking about all these different questions or all these different ideas that are being proposed here and all the different social challenges. And I think one way we could help communicate and collaborate more would just be working with land managers and practitioners on the ground. They're the ones that are really interacting with the public a lot. And so really being able to take this complex science and being able to distill it down into messages that the public can really relate to and that resonates with them. I think another sort of social challenge that we have, and I mentioned this in my presentation, was that there is a focus in on forest fires, and that there really are wildfires are occurring in many different ecotypes, and some are burning too much, some are not burning enough. And so it's really being able to get our messaging right for the appropriate regions. And I would say that not just down you know, at the local level with our local communities, but also up into a congressional, where our policies, our laws are being made, you know, making sure they've got the right messages as well, and they've got the right focus. And so, yeah, and just also being able to identify areas, you know, that the different reasons that fire is sort of out of whack, if you will, you know, one being the invasives, the spread of invasives. And that's a really big challenge to address. And yet it just keeps on increasing year after year after year. And that's within forested ecosystems, desert ecosystems, just across the board.
Well, Matt, I got 1140.
Yeah, I think we have, did Nikki raised her hand in the chat. Nikki, did you have something you wanted to add before we move on?
Yes, really quick. So I think one of the challenges that I come across, and especially with the tribal folks I come and work with, is that we silo ourselves into departments, agency. I mean, that's just how it is, but we silo ourselves, you know, where tribes are like a separate entity, and not instead of a collaborative partner. If we change that mindset, I think that could be a really a great positive for building those trustful relationships for collaborative partnerships in the future. Yeah, that's a social challenge. I mean, when I used to work for the Forest Service, when I was doing my master's studies in North Carolina, it was very much siloed. And that was something, it was tribes versus the Forest Service versus the non-tribal community. And I think somebody mentioned that already, but it really needs to go beyond and just get rid of that mindset. And that's kind of what we try to do at ITEP. So I just want to mention that.
Yeah, I think that's an important theme we need to keep thinking about, and I know we will throughout the rest of this workshop, especially in our breakout groups. Joe, you want to send us off?
I do. I'd like everybody to unmute and thank all our speakers, our panelists. I really enjoyed the discussion, gang.
All right, so Joe, I take it we're ready to start back up.
Go for it, Ginny.
All right, so now we're gonna do 20 minutes of breakout discussion. And some people have dropped in and out, and so I reorganized some of the groups so that no one was left in a group of just 2 or 3. So now everyone should have at least 4. Most groups have more. So if you are organized into a different group, I apologize, but when I click open the rooms, it'll show you what room you're in. And so for this next part, I'll give you a brief tutorial on mural. Corey is going to put in the chat. There will be 3 murals we're going to work on. A mural is a virtual giant whiteboard. And so if you're in any of the desert biome groups, there will be one link to get to that mural, and then you'll navigate to your group on the mural. There'll be one link for Western Forests and one link for Mediterranean Chaparral. So Corey's going to put those links in the chat, and I will go over a brief mural tutorial. So when you click on the links, you will come to something that looks like this. And so it's, like I said, this giant virtual whiteboard. So one of the first things that you're going to want to do is learn how to zoom in and out. So it's really easy to do on a mouse, but if your mouse doesn't have that capability, or if you're on your phone or something, you can use down in the, come on now, down in the lower right corner, there we go, circled in red here, there is this kind of grayed out zoom application here in the corner. So at the top, you can zoom in and out to make it bigger and smaller, or you can drag around on the little board here that's grayed out. But I use, again, my mouse. That's the easiest for me. So what you want to do is zoom all the way out so that you see the mural, and then zoom back in when you locate your group on the mural, zoom all the way in so that the only thing that's fitting in your window is your little rectangle with your group. So then once you are there, you will want to go down to the bottom and hover over your mouse, hover over your icon, and yours will be the first icon to the left. And when you hover over it, sometimes you might not see your icons because you have to accept cookies to be able to use this mural. So once you accept cookies or decline it, then once that window goes away, you should see your icons, and hover over your icon and click on Don't Show Me Cursors, because there'll be, about 40 people on each mural, and so you don't want to just see like a bunch of visiting rabbits, jumping all over moving all over the mural. It gets a little distracting. So check Don't Show Me Cursors, and then you'll only see your own. Then from there, it's pretty easy. You just double click to add a sticky note. If you don't want to double click and you want more options, up here in your control panel to the left, there are the shapes you can add. You can add text and stickies, or if you like what someone else said and you don't want to write your own thing, you can star or give a thumbs up to another sticky. And your facilitators in each of your group will help you place stickies, or if you don't want to do it at all, they'll just capture your thoughts on the sticky notes. And I've preloaded each section with a few sticky notes to get you started. All right, I think that's it. So with that, yeah, take a few minutes at the beginning of your groups to play around with the mural and learn how to place stickies and write on it. Oh, and there will be separate recorders that will be looking over all of these murals. And so, if you have multiple people agreeing on a same thought or sticky, maybe make it bigger. You can drag the sticky to make it bigger, or put a star on it so that they know. Let's see. Oh, and the 3 questions, they're kind of small in my tutorial here, but if you're on the mural, you can see them. 3 questions you'll want to answer with your group are: what major climate wildfire changes are expected to affect fire management in your bioregion? What tools and data are needed to address these changes? And how do we facilitate the generation of new tools, science, and integrate them into fire management? So that's what you'll be answering over the next 20 minutes. And when we leave the groups, I'm not going to automatically close the breakouts at the end of the 20 minutes because the reporters need a few minutes to stay in their breakout rooms to discuss what they're going to report out. So I will just ask that you leave the breakout room manually, but you don't want to click on the wrong button and leave the meeting. So I'll have instructions for that when it gets close to that time, and your facilitators know what to do too. All right, with that, I think we will go to our breakout rooms. Here we go.
But I do see that we had about 30 people in the room when we gave our spiel, and we're up to 90 now. So we're going to be sorry for those of you who already heard it. Maybe I'll make it even shorter. Talking about follow-up materials. So the first thing is, I think we'll repost in the chat too, but there's a survey link there, and there's 2 parts of this survey. I'll let Barb talk about the first part, but the second part is a little note to yourself. So you can type in something you'd like to follow up with yourself in about 3 months or so. So a note for about a 3-month future you. And we're either going to email that out to you in 3 months, or we're going to send it through the mail. So you get a little fun postcard if you put your address in there. So that's just a little, I like that. I actually did this at a meeting about a year ago, and it was great to get a postcard from myself from however long ago that was, reminding me to follow up on something, and I actually did it because I had the capacity to do it instead of right after the meeting.
Yeah, that was a really great idea. I think it's nice to remind yourself what you wanted to do. So in the first part of the survey, the link is in the chat window again, but the first part of the survey is just some basic questions, what you got out of the workshop, and it really helps us to improve future events. So critical feedback is just as good as saying that we did a great job. So, you know, anything you can provide, we appreciate. And it does help us to continue to get funding in the future. So if you see value in what we do, please offer some feedback. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you, Stacy. And before we turn it over to our reporters, I just want to remind you that we have been recording the meeting. The recording will be posted very soon on the California Great Basin and Southwest Fire Science Exchanges. And hopefully by early January, we will have a summary white paper posted on those 3 science exchanges as well. So Jeannie, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, and in turn, turn it over to our reporters.
Joe, I thought you were introducing the reporters.
I can do that. I didn't know I was going to do that, but I can do that.
Okay.
We're going to start off with Western Forest, and it's the Julies, Julie Murphy and Julie Toro. Thank you, both of you. What'd you see? Let's answer those questions.
Hi, yeah. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, there's a lot going on. Pretty tough to summarize it really quickly. But I'll start with what major climate and wildfire changes are expected to affect fire management in your bioregion. So there's a lot, but there's a lot of overlap as well. So some of the big ones we're seeing, obviously temperature is a big concern, higher temperatures, greater flammability, drier vegetation, drought, dry vegetation of fuels, big concern, increasing numbers of ignitions. In terms of vegetation, we're looking at type conversion, increased invasive species, the spread of invasive species, and then general, when there's changes in species composition, the differences in how those species are adapted to fire. We are looking at insect outbreaks, disease outbreaks, the impacts of reburns, and then long-term recovery of burned areas. We also have a lot of comments about hydrology and water. So the timing and type of precipitation, the combined drought and wildfire impacts on water resources, the problems of post-fire debris flow. Let's see what else. Some more, human impacts, personnel shortages and burnout, risks to firefighters, overtaxed resources, and then a general concern around, a lot of concern around the extension of the fire season, so longer fire seasons, meaning longer, really suppression seasons, and that time spent on suppression takes away from the time that we can spend on prevention and other preventive management, prescribed burns, and others. So I will turn it over to Julia Toro for the tools and data.
All right, so again, there was quite a bit, and I'm going to do my best to capture it all. So the next question was, what tools and data are needed to address these changes? There were quite a few comments about watershed and water-related tools needed to understand how to treat and assess damage and needs of those areas. Regionally consistent data sets was another one that came up. And then about the kind of tools that people want dynamic tools that can capture changing conditions, and then using tools that already exist rather than developing new ones all of the time. Non-contact evacuation tools, and also being able to predict which areas were vulnerable beforehand, and evacuation preparation and home hardening stuff. There was also improving monitoring networks between agency and ecosystem types, so remote and in situ based measurements, invasive species detection and management, power grid improvements, and how we could potentially shut off on a smaller scale when necessary, and then fuel breaks that can withstand extreme weather. And a big one was better communication amongst communities and agencies, better outreach, better education for the public, advanced modeling software for projecting impacts, investment in training for larger workforces, pre-fire data, and tools for implementing broader cross-boundary projects and relationship building. So that brings us to our last question.
All right.
Thanks,
yeah, okay. So how do we facilitate the generation of new tools, science, and integrate them into fire management? I've loosely grouped these responses into collaboration, funding, research, policy, and then data and tools that people are looking for. So under collaboration, the biggest one that comes across is cross-agency funding, collaboration, and partnerships. The inclusion of traditional ecological knowledge and local knowledge when developing plans, training among field level resources, qualified pool, and other staffing options, and then stakeholder engagement and advocacy. Under funding, folks are looking for dedicated funding for monitoring response to wildfire, funding for monitoring of fuels treatments, and then watershed grant money, and increasing personnel to do fuels reduction work. For the research academia world, someone said to prioritize metrics other than publications for tenure track researchers, and so incentivize working with practitioners instead. I love that. Institutionalizing the co-production of science, and then increasing capacity, funding, and understanding of thinning burning effects, and then kind of looking at the trade-off between studying the problem and managing the problem, which is you know, a funding challenge that we have. So under policy, loosely, they're saying we want to improve communication to policymakers, improve tools for facilitating risk-based dialogue, and then how to collaborate with insurance and reinsurance providers. Then under data and tools, I have leverage long-term remote sensing data, collaborative on-the-ground adaptation techniques. The question of maybe is it, you know, government and academia that's developing high-end tools, or do we need to partner with private sector? People liked John's tool showing no analog environments, and tools to monitor the effects of management and adapt as conditions change. And that's what we got. There's lots more, and I think you will get the opportunity on the Menti to address any questions that that we missed in our report. So thank you.
That was a great job, you two. Thank you. A lot there, a lot of information to engulf. Jeannie, are we going to have an opportunity for input from our Western Forest folks?
Yeah, I think Corey was gonna, we changed it up a little bit in the background. So Corey was gonna share the Mentimeter What Did We Miss Q&A. And I know that it says in our agenda that we're gonna go over what we missed after each one, which we can still do, but I wonder if we should, I guess I shouldn't change things up on the, on the fly. So.
Does anybody want to add a comment? A lot of information coming out of there. And again, what's really neat about Mural is that it's there permanently, so we can go back the planning team could go back and use that information that you've provided.
Yes, there'll be a summary of responses that will come out at, hopefully next month to answer the question here.
Does anybody want to add anything at this time regarding Western forests on any of the questions? Okay, then I'm going to suggest we move on. Let's go to deserts. And Leah and Katie, you're on. Report out. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So overall, we saw a lot of groups having concern over increasing fire frequency and intensity, as well as invasive species. Many groups mentioned the need to scale both research data and tools to more regional and ecosystem appropriate levels. And groups were overall looking for more collaboration. So Katie, do you want to take question 1?
Yes, absolutely. So with question 1, most responses fell into 3 categories. The first being longer wildfire seasons or increased fire size and frequency. Concerns included post-fire effects on water and hydrologic resources, lack of recovery following fire, or reduced regeneration of natives. 4 groups said that or more. We may have missed a few in the count. But soil erosion due to loss in plants and biocrust fell under that concern, as well as managing fire in non-adapted ecosystems, which came up frequently. Another concern was invasive annual grasses. More than 4 groups mentioned it, both expansion and new invasive species. Concerns that fall under that category are managing positive feedbacks, ecosystem conversion, altered fuel structure, and the native species interaction with invasive species. Finally, the last overarching concern in this question was drought increase in frequency and severity. More than 4 groups mentioned it, as well as monsoonal shifts. Sub-concerns include effects of drought and temperature on fire size and frequency, and higher climate variability or unpredictability. And finally, one that didn't quite fall in any of those categories is understanding the consequences of human energy developments on fire. For question 2, tools generally fell into tools to address spatial issues, temporal issues, and logistic and technical challenges. So tools that address issues of spatial scale are landscape scale restoration options, like from an economic standpoint, landscape tools that quantify threats, like rangeland analysis platforms, scaling models for different ecosystems and regions, and better quality, better quality of climate and weather data. Multiple groups mentioned that. Tools that tackle issues of temporal scales, long-term tracking and forecasting, as well as successional modeling, better understanding of species ranges and adaptability, dynamic tools for unpredictable or changing environmental conditions, and more data on community dynamics leading to post-fire trajectories, as well as a better understanding of fuel conditions under varying climate and vegetation changes. In terms of logistical tools, restoration approaches include prescribed fire in different seasonal windows, like cool season burning, native seed sources, which is mentioned by more than 3 groups, early detection and management of invasive species, understanding fuel break effectiveness, and fire effects of soil recovery in the Great Basin and Mojave transition, and including soil and models. Another logistical tool is collaboration, which included incorporating community science, co-producing tools to prevent redundancy, and streamlined NEPA. I'm going to hand the last question over to Leah.
Thanks, Katie. So for 3, how do we facilitate the generation of new tools, science, and integrate them into fire management? Folks were looking for more support from leadership and appropriators. They were looking for increased funding opportunities, especially for more collaboration and co-production of tools, as well as with broader disciplines. Groups were also looking to increase and incentivize partnerships and collaborations between researchers, agencies, tribes, incorporating TEK, and working with the private sector. Along those same lines, they were looking for more knowledge exchange symposia like this one, increasing public awareness. They wanted to see more vulnerability assessments and more progress reporting, especially in research in new ecosystems. And they also wanted to see more training opportunities like READ.
Thank you, Leah. Thanks, Katie. Anybody want to comment on, there's a lot there. Thank you so much. You did a fantastic job. But I'll turn it over to the crew here, the entire crew. Is there anything you want to add?
It looks like the main things that came up in the questions and in the chat were just that we need a lot more funding for these these types of positions, crossover positions. And then also need more information on aquatic systems for forests and deserts. That's all that came through. So you guys did a good job. You covered everything else.
A lot there. Thank you for summarizing those, and thanks for that input. Lastly, Mediterranean Chaparral. This is Andrew and Karina.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karina. I'll start out and just get right into the first question we have here. So I think it's pretty similar to a lot of other folks on this call. So we've got concerns about less coastal fog, hotter and drier climates, larger storms, the variability in precipitation, dry lightning, and type conversion. There were concerns also about air quality and effects of fires on areas further away from the fires. Concerns about drought, definitely a lot of mentions of the human factor, so increased presence of humans on the wildland-urban interface, and then fires on the wildland-urban interface contributing to contaminants in the debris flows and in the air. Debris flow was also mentioned several times, and including sedimentation of reservoirs as a concern. And then one group specifically mentioned differing burn windows and maybe burning more during the winter. And then in terms of tools and data needed to address these changes, people really focused on public outreach and doing more management. So someone said no management is bad management. They also asked for multiple scale modeling and looking at longer term, having a longer term outlook, more precise weather forecasting and more precise models in general. Asking, a lot of groups were focusing on pre and post fire monitoring tools and databases. So really placing emphasis on getting good data about pre-fire conditions. And looking at also watershed models for the sediment transport, surface water, and nutrient cycling. So that goes along with those debris flows and variability in precipitation. And also really emphasized having a better social network and perhaps even analyzing the social network so that relationships among landowners can be strengthened. And then I'm going to pass it on to Andrew for the rest.
Karina, so the first note I'll start out with is more resources for managing multiple fires. I'm not sure what they mean, but I believe they're talking about management teams, remote sensing tools for changes in fuel type / vegetation cover, which could then lead to better fuels management practices or best fuels management practices. And this links back to the concern about air quality decreasing as climate change worsens, better monitoring of air quality, in situ measures / monitoring, and accessible info of climate change effects in different regions. So for our third question, how do we facilitate the generation of new tools / science and integrate them into fire management? Start off with better planning. We want to engage planner/government in urban and rural areas, and the interfaces. Collaboration, coordinated monitoring between agencies, because it's good when people talk to each other, and linked to that is increased science and policymaker interactions. We also had multiple groups mentioned education and outreach. Linked to that could be firefighter training in fire ecology, which could lead to better decisions on the ground. We want management plans and resource management plans updated with fire climate relationships. And this will help us better target prescribed burn areas. We also want pre-fire databases available for comparison with post-fire. And an interesting note was investment in cloud infrastructure for timely communication and modeling, which really links back to the whole collaboration and partnerships with remote sensing tool developers. And we'll end it with the connecting thing, I think, for us all, which was more funding.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Karina. Looks like we have one other comment here. Would like to see an analyses of policy hurdles for using federal programs to promote restoration of native vegetation. For example, native seed production by private landowners cannot be paid for by NRCSs as it is seen as competing with industry. Any other final comments, particularly for Mediterranean Chaparral, or for that part, for any of these breakout groups? Then I'm going to thank our early career people. Thank you so much. That was a tough job. It's a tough job on short notice, meaning you only have a few minutes to go in there and glean so much information. Good job. I really appreciate that. There's a wealth of information there. So I'm going to try to close things out. Let me just remind you again, forgive the redundancy. We will post a recording of the meeting on the 3 Fire Science Exchange websites and a white paper. And that white paper should be available in January sometime. I have an ominous task here of trying to synthesize what I heard today, and I'm going to do my best. And if I made some mistakes interpreting what I heard, particularly from speakers, that's on me. Send me an email. You can chastise me for that. But this is what I think I heard today. So let me summarize. We had about 165 people register for the meeting. Usually about 105 were participating, but people were going in and out throughout the entire meeting. Most of us today were researchers from federal agencies. Going back to the 3 C's that we wanted to, or our concerns were, what we wanted to take away, our concerns were community preparation, climate change, and collaboration. I want to remind you of some of the goals or objectives that we wanted to achieve today. And simply put, identify some fire science and management needs, provide an awareness of tools for decision-making in future uncertain conditions, generate science and management actions. How do we accomplish these identified needs and actions and integrate them into management? And lastly, make connections. I would argue that we've checked all these boxes. I'm really impressed with the wealth of information that you supplied on science directions and how we integrate our actions into fire management. And that came out during the breakout groups with the sticky notes, and I really appreciate that. Some of the themes that I heard today. The theme I heard was, we're in this together. I also heard the theme in talks that there are challenges out there. There are uncertainties. There are problems. But as an ex-manager, what I like to hear is there are solutions too. And so solutions were posited, you know, in every talk. Paul's key message to me was we need to build relationships across organizations and share information and tools to leverage resources. For Lenya, I heard relationships are just incredibly important. She talked about scaling deeper, which made me think about things a little bit differently. And by that, we need to take into account cultural values and beliefs, and smaller solutions are okay. And I was impressed as well that TREX, the Prescribed Fire Training Exchange, was worldwide, which I had no idea it was. Andi, Fire Climb, this is a model of co-production. And by model, I'm not talking about a mathematical model. I'm talking about, this is exemplary. This is how we get people together to work together from start to finish. And by working collaboratively, she showed that we can, and her partners, we can develop models and vulnerability assessments and a menu of fire climate adaptation strategies that facilitate effective management. That menu, I recommend you go to her website. That menu to me was pretty spectacular and detailed. We need to bring people together, another message from Andi, to leverage time and resources. And forgive me, I'm reading from my notes. John, golly, the tools that you provided are just amazing. There are meteorological tools, hydroclimate tools, mappers, and so forth. But what I'm really excited about is this forthcoming integrative climate analog tool that allows managers to find a climate most similar to what is projected at their site in the future. That's going to be, I think, really, really informative and helpful. And climate is the interannual enabler of forest fire extent. Michele, altered fire regimes in sagebrush ecosystems, they impact a suite of ecosystem services and cultural practices, and you brought that out. Invasive grasses are a serious problem in the sagebrush, excuse me. Another theme you called for is we're in this together, and I appreciate that. You also made the comment that we need to change the public's understanding of fire. And you provided tools as well, Science Framework 1 and tool, that help prioritize management sites. Carolyn and Molly, interesting, at least to me, you echoed a lot of what Michele echoed, but you were in the Sonoran Desert. We're going to see increased invasive grasses there and drought. You called for a need for cross-jurisdictional coordinated fuels reduction and watershed planning. And you proposed a holistic approach to fire management. And you consider public values, and you must have the community buy-in on education. Hugh, in Southern California, I found this interesting. Shrublands are projected by the end of the century to be reduced by half and grassland to significantly increase. You also taught, and fire was the driver of that key change. You showed that there are multiple efforts underway to conserve and sustain good management practices in the Chaparral. You also talked about degradation of ecosystem services over time, and you mentioned some of those like carbon storage and biodiversity and sediment retention. You also proposed the post-fire restoration planning tool, again, which prioritizes areas for restoration. So again, I think we were running on all 8 cylinders when we were talking about tools today, so we hit those, and I appreciate that. Nikki, you and your climate team, you proposed that we need to include culture and environmental management in our future planning. You made the note that for Indigenous peoples, this relationship with the environment is nonlinear. And you've been doing co-production for a long, long time. You also talked about resilience and adaptation planning, and to bridge traditional knowledge with current colonial Anglo knowledge, and I appreciate that. I probably missed something here. I'm not even going to try to go through all of what our early career reporters talked about regarding the 3 questions that we asked you to discuss in the breakouts, but I thought you did a fantastic job. I really appreciate everyone on the call just providing so many neat and interesting answers to these 3 questions. I think they'll be incredibly useful. And I want to end saying this, and we are ending just a little bit early. I want to thank everyone attending today. A special thanks to our speakers, our reporters, our facilitators. I really appreciate your time and effort. Happy holidays to you, and be safe out there. Thanks again for attending.
Before we sign off, Joe, from the rest of the planning committee, we want to thank you so much. Give a shout out to you, because I don't know how many people know that this was supposed to be an in-person workshop way back in April, and we changed it to virtual. And Joe, he is so meticulous about all the little details, and we're so thankful. We probably had 2 or 3 practices and a dress rehearsal, and there's always something. There's still always a little thing, but if you enjoyed this workshop, we owe it to Joe, because
that's nice.
Yeah,
that's nice.
You're a great leader, Joe. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, gang. You were great to work with.